June 27th, 1874. The sound that saved 28 lives was not a bugle call or a shouted warning, but the dry, sharp crack of a cottonwood ridgepole snapping under the weight of a sod roof. Inside the cramped, smoke-stained interior of Hanrahan's saloon, the noise cut through the heavy air like a pistol shot, jarring James Hanrahan awake in the pre-dawn darkness. The saloon owner sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes straining against the gloom of the adobe walls trading post. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. If the roof collapsed, it would crush everyone sleeping beneath it. He shouted for the men to wake up, his voice rough with sleep and panic. In the adjacent buildings, the buffalo hunters stirred, grumbling as they pulled on boots and reached for the Sharps rifles that never left their sides. They were men hardened by the slaughter of the southern herd, their clothes stiff with dried blood and grease, their hands calloused from skinning knives and triggers. They did not know that the breaking wood was the only reason they would see the sunrise. Outside the thick sod walls, the Texas Panhandle was silent. The tall grass of the Canadian River Valley stood motionless in the stillness of the early morning. Beyond the perimeter of the 3 main buildings, Hanrahan's saloon, Myers and Leonard's store, and Rath and Wright's store, the darkness concealed a gathering force that the hunters could not imagine. 700 warriors from the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne tribes lay in wait in the tall grass in the ravines. They were painted for war. Their horses were restless, sensing the tension radiating from the men who held their reins. This was not a raiding party looking for horses or cattle. This was an army assembled for extermination. The motivation for this gathering sat rotting on the plains surrounding the outpost. For months, the buffalo hunters had operated out of adobe walls, venturing onto the Llano Estacado to kill bison by the thousands. They stripped the hides and left the carcasses to rot under the sun. The stench of decay drifted on the wind for miles, a physical reminder to the tribes that their commissary, their shelter, and their spiritual center were being erased from the earth. The tribes had watched the white men stack hides like cordwood. They had seen the bones bleaching in the sun. The anger had solidified into a single diamond-hard resolve. They would kill every man at adobe walls and then sweep the plains clean of the invaders. Leading them was Quanah Parker, the son of a Comanche chief and a captive white woman. He rode with a cold fury, intent on driving the hunters back across the Arkansas River. Beside him rode Isatai, a medicine man who had risen to prominence on a wave of desperation and prophecy. Isatai had claimed he possessed a medicine strong enough to stop the white man's bullets. He had told the warriors that if they followed his instructions, the hunters' guns would misfire or the bullets would fall harmlessly to the ground. He had painted his body with yellow ochre and claimed the power to belch up wagon loads of cartridges. The warriors believed him because they had to believe him. The alternative was the slow starvation of their people. Inside the outpost, the men worked to shore up the sagging roof. Billy Dixon, a 23-year-old marksman whose name was already known across the frontier, helped prop up the beam. The physical exertion chased away the last remnants of sleep. By the time the roof was secure, the eastern sky was beginning to turn the color of bruised iron. The air was cool. Most of the men decided it was too late to go back to sleep. They began to dress for the day, checking their ammunition belts and brewing strong coffee. Billy Dixon and a man named Billy Ogg walked outside to retrieve their horses from the nearby creek. The air smelled of sage and damp earth. Dixon looked toward the line of cottonwood trees along the creek bottom. He saw something move. At first, the shape was indistinct against the tree line. Then it resolved into a mass of riders. The silence of the morning shattered. A collective war cry erupted from hundreds of throats, a terrifying sound that froze the blood of the men caught in the open. The ground shook as the ponies thundered forward, their hooves tearing up the turf. The warriors charged in a solid line, a wave of color and motion. Red, black, and yellow paint streaked their bodies and faces. Feathers and buffalo horns adorned their headdresses. They rode low on their horses, presenting small targets, their rifles and lances raised. Dixon and Og turned and ran. It was a desperate sprint back to the safety of the sod buildings. Bullets kicked up dirt around their heels, the air filled with the angry buzz of lead and the whistle of arrows. Dixon saw his horse look up, eyes wide with terror, before the animal bolted. He did not look back. He scrambled for the door of Hanrahan's saloon. He dove inside just as the first wave of warriors slammed into the buildings. The hunters slammed the heavy wooden doors shut and barred them with whatever was at hand. They smashed out the glass of the small windows and shoved the barrels of their sharps rifles through the openings. The interior of the saloon was dark, illuminated only by the flashes of muzzle fire. The noise was deafening. The boom of the heavy-caliber buffalo guns mixed with the lighter crack of Winchesters and Colt revolvers. The room filled with the acrid smoke of black powder, stinging the eyes and coating the throat. Outside, the battle was chaotic and brutal. The warriors rode right up to the walls of the buildings, striking the sod with their lances and quirts. They fired through the windows and the chinking in the logs. Some dismounted and tried to batter down the doors. The hunters, men who made their living by placing a single bullet into the heart of a buffalo at 500 yards, now found themselves firing at point-blank range. A hunter named the Bermuda Carlyle fell dead in the initial volley, shot through the lungs. Two Shadler brothers, who had been sleeping in their wagon outside, were killed instantly, their bodies scalped and left in the dirt. Quanah Parker led charge after charge. He rode a gray horse, weaving through the gunfire with a reckless disregard for safety. He wanted to breach the walls. He wanted to get inside where the long-range rifles of the hunters would be useless against knives and tomahawks. But the sod walls held. The thick earth absorbed the bullets of the Comanche and Kiowa. The hunters, calm despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins, began to find their rhythm. They did not fire rapidly. They fired with precision. Each time a warrior exposed himself to fire a shot or attempt to force a door, a .50 caliber slug tore through the air to meet him. The heavy lead bullets, designed to drop a 2,000-pound bull buffalo in its tracks, devastated human flesh. Warriors were knocked from their horses, their bodies broken by the impact. Horses screamed as they were hit, collapsing in tangled heaps of limbs and tack. The ground around the trading post began to litter with the dead and dying. Isatai watched from a nearby hill. He sat on his horse, naked except for his yellow paint and a bonnet of sage stems. He waited for the white men's guns to fail. He waited for the bullets to drop from the air. Instead, he saw his horse shot out from under him. A bullet grazed his shoulder. The invincibility he had promised evaporated in the face of the hunter's cold efficiency. The warriors, seeing their medicine man vulnerable and their comrades falling, began to falter. The absolute confidence that had fueled the initial charge began to curdle into doubt. The sun climbed higher, baking the valley. The heat inside the sod buildings became oppressive. The men sweated through their shirts. Their faces were blackened with powder residue. They shouted to one another between shots, checking ammunition counts and calling out targets. They knew that if the Indians breached the walls, they would die. There was no cavalry coming to save them. They were alone in the middle of the Comancheria. Their survival depended entirely on the mechanical reliability of their rifles and the steadiness of their hands. By mid-morning, the initial fury of the assault had broken. The warriors pulled back to the tree lines and the ridges surrounding the outpost, but staying out of the immediate range of the windows. The siege began. The hunters took stock of their situation. They had ammunition. They had water in the saloon, but they were trapped. The smell of gun smoke began to mix with the metallic scent of blood and the rising stench of the dead horses and men lying in the yard. Quanah Parker did not give up. He rallied his men, urging them to keep up the pressure. He knew the psychological toll of a siege. He directed fire at the windows, keeping the hunters pinned down. But the hunters had an advantage that the tribes did not fully comprehend: the range of their weapons. The Sharps rifles could kill effectively at distances far greater than the carbines and trade muskets carried by most of the warriors. As the afternoon wore on, the hunters began to pick off targets that the warriors thought were safe. A warrior showing his head above a ridgeline 600 yards away would suddenly drop, his skull shattered. A rider moving between clumps of trees nearly half a mile out would be knocked from his saddle. The psychological impact of this long-range death was profound. It denied the warriors any safe ground within sight of the outpost. They could not rest. They could not regroup without fear of a bullet striking them from nowhere. During a lull in the fighting, Billy Dixon noticed a group of warriors on a high bluff to the east. They were nearly a mile away, a distance that should have rendered them untouchable. They sat on their horses, outlined against the sky, seemingly mocking the men trapped in the mud buildings. Dixon raised his Sharps. It was a big .50, a rifle with a heavy octagonal barrel. He adjusted the rear ladder sight, elevating the barrel to account for the immense drop of the bullet over such a distance. He calculated the wind, feeling the slight breeze on his cheek. The men in the saloon watched him. It was an impossible shot. The target was a speck on the horizon. Dixon exhaled, steadying the heavy rifle against the window frame. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, kicking back against his shoulder. A cloud of white smoke obscured the view for a second. It took several seconds for the heavy lead slug to traverse the distance. Then, on the bluff, one of the warriors fell backward off his horse. The others scattered instantly. The shot became legend, but in that moment it was a message. It told the tribes that there was no safety here. It told them that the white men could reach out and kill them at distances that defied the laws of nature as they understood them. The failure of Issa Tai's medicine was complete. The warriors had been promised immunity. Instead, they had faced a wall of lead that could not be breached. Quanah Parker himself was wounded during the fight, a bullet striking him in the shoulder and knocking him unconscious for a time. When he awoke, the pain was a sharp reminder of the reality of the situation. The tribes had lost the element of surprise. They had lost the advantage of numbers against the fortifications, and now they were losing their will to fight. The prophecy had been a lie. As the sun began to set, the firing tapered off. The warriors began to slip away, retrieving what dead and wounded they could, though many had to be left where they fell close to the walls. The hunters remained at their posts, eyes scanning the deepening shadows. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They reloaded their weapons and drank tepid water from barrels. They knew the warriors might return. The attack on adobe walls was a tactical defeat for the tribes. They had failed to wipe out the hunters. They had lost heavily in terms of men and horses, but strategically, it was the spark that ignited the entire southern plains. The news of the attack spread rapidly. It reached the reservations. It reached the isolated settlements. Most importantly, it reached the halls of the War Department in Washington, D.C. For years, the official policy toward the Comanches and Kiowas had been one of containment and negotiation, known as the peace policy. The government had tried to coax the tribes onto reservations with promises of food and supplies, promises that were rarely kept. The attack on adobe walls proved to the military hardliners that the peace policy was a failure. The tribes were not pacified. They were organized, they were armed, and they were willing to strike back with overwhelming force. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the commanding general of the United States Army, read the reports from Texas with a grim satisfaction. He had long advocated for a more aggressive stance. The attack gave him the political capital he needed to authorize a total war. There would be no more negotiations. There would be no more treaties. The order went out to the Department of the Missouri and the Department of Texas. Every Indian found off the reservation was to be considered hostile. They were to be hunted down, defeated, and forced back onto the reservation or exterminated. The hunters at Adobe Walls buried the Shadler brothers in a single grave near the corral. They dragged the dead horses away from the buildings to burn them, the pyres sending thick, oily smoke into the sky. They fortified the buildings, piling sacks of grain and flour against the walls. They sent riders out under the cover of darkness to Fort Dodge to ask for help. But the true significance of the day was not in the survival of the 28 men. It was in the reaction of the United States government. The attack on Adobe Walls ended the era of skirmishes and raids. It initiated the Red River War. The army began to mobilize. 5 separate columns of troops were ordered to converge on the Texas Panhandle. They would come from the north, south, east, and west. They would scour the canyons and the plains. They would not stop for winter. They would not stop for weather. They would bring the full industrial might of the post-Civil War military to bear on the horse tribes of the southern plains. Quanah Parker and the other chiefs led their people away from Adobe Walls, moving deeper into the vastness of the Llano Estacado. They believed the plains were big enough to hide them. They believed the canyons would protect them as they always had. They did not know that the maps were being drawn. They did not know that the telegraph wires were humming with orders for their destruction. They did not know that the shot Billy Dixon fired was the opening note of their requiem. The tribes dispersed, splitting into smaller bands to hunt and prepare for winter. They went to their traditional strongholds, places where the white soldiers had never dared to go. They went to the Palo Duro Canyon, a great slash in the earth that offered water, grass, and shelter from the biting north winds. They believed they were safe there. They believed the war was over for the season. But the war had just begun. The machinery of conquest was grinding into motion, and it would not stop until the free life of the plains was extinguished forever. August 23, 1874. The heat at Fort Concho was a physical weight, pressing down on the limestone buildings and the parade ground with an intensity that turned the air into a shimmering haze. At the confluence of the North and South Concho rivers in West Texas, the temperature frequently rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and on this day there was no shade to be found for the men standing in formation. 600 soldiers stood rigidly beside their mounts, the leather of their saddles hot to the touch, the metal of their carbines burning their hands. They were the 4th United States Cavalry, widely regarded as the most effective combat unit on the western frontier. And they were preparing to march into a wasteland that few white men had ever seen and returned from. Commanding them was Colonel Ranald Slidell Mackenzie, a man whose physical presence was a testament to the violence of his profession. At 34 years old, he looked a decade older. His body was a map of the American Civil War. He carried 6 distinct wounds from battles at Bull Run, Gettysburg, and Petersburg. The most visible of these was his right hand, which was missing 2 fingers, earning him the name Bad Hand among the Comanche and Kiowa. The pain from his injuries was constant, a low-level static that spiked into agony with every change in the weather or jolt of his horse. It made him irritable, demanding, and prone to explosive outbursts of temper. It also made him relentless. He did not govern his men with affection. He governed them with a discipline so rigid that it bordered on tyranny. Mackenzie sat on his horse, his eyes scanning the lines of troopers. He knew that the campaign ahead would not be a standard patrol. General Philip Sheridan and General William Tecumseh Sherman had devised a strategy that relied on total convergence. They authorized 5 separate military columns to descend on the Texas Panhandle simultaneously. Colonel Nelson Miles would strike south from Fort Dodge, Kansas. Lieutenant Colonel John Davidson would move west from Fort Sill, Indian Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Buell would march northwest from Fort Griffin. Major William Price would push east from New Mexico. And Mackenzie, with the southern column, would drive north from Fort Concho. The plan was a massive pincer movement designed to squeeze the hostile bands into the unmapped canyons of the Staked Plains and crush them. The order to move out cut through the stagnant air. The column lurched forward, a mechanical beast of iron, leather, and flesh beginning its slow grind toward the north. This was not a swift raiding party, it was a heavy logistical machine. Behind the 8 companies of cavalry marched 4 companies of the 10th Infantry and 1 company of the 11th Infantry to guard the supply train. The train itself was immense, consisting of dozens of heavy wagons pulled by 6 mule teams. They carried tons of grain for the horses, ammunition, and rations for the men. The wheels of the wagons ground deep ruts into the dry earth, kicking up a plume of dust that rose thousands of feet into the air, marking their passage for miles. As the column left the relative civilization of the Concho Valley, the reality of the mission settled over the troopers. Many were veterans of the Civil War, men who had seen the slaughter at Antietam and the wilderness. Others were fresh immigrants from Ireland and Germany, men who had signed up for the steady pay of $13 a month and found themselves in a landscape that resembled nothing in Europe. They wore blue wool uniforms that were entirely unsuited for the Texas summer. Sweat soaked through the heavy fabric within minutes of the sun rising, turning the wool into a stifling, itchy torment. Salt stains bloomed white on the backs of their tunics. The discipline on the march was absolute. Mackenzie allowed no straggling. A soldier who fell behind was a soldier dead, either from exposure or from the Comanche scouting parties that shadowed the edges of the column. The men rode in a column of 2s, the clop-clop of horseshoes on hardpan ringing out in a monotonous rhythm. They rode for 50 minutes, then dismounted and walked for 10 to spare the horses' backs. The health of the animals was prioritized over the comfort of the men. A cavalryman without a horse in this country was a stationary target. Mackenzie inspected the horses personally, checking for saddle sores and hoof rot. He ordered that the grain be guarded as closely as the ammunition. Leading the column, far ahead of the main body, rode the scouts. This was a unique element of Mackenzie's force, a group that operated with a fluidity that contrasted with the rigid order of the regulars. Lieutenant John Lapham Bullis commanded the Seminole Negro Scouts, a unit of black Seminoles who had fled to Mexico to escape slavery and later returned to serve the U.S. Army. These men were supreme trackers, capable of reading the ground like a printed page. They could distinguish the age of a hoofprint by the crumble of the dirt at its edge. They could smell water miles before it appeared. Riding with them were Tonkawa scouts, fierce enemies of the Comanche who had allied with the army out of a desire for revenge against the tribe that had decimated their numbers years prior. The scouts served as the eyes of the Iron Column. They fanned out across the horizon, checking ravines and ridgelines for sign of the hostiles. They knew the terrain better than any map maker in Washington. They knew that the column was heading toward the Caprock Escarpment, a massive geological fault line that separated the rolling plains of Texas from the high, flat tableland of the Llano Estacado. The Llano was a place of legend and terror, a flat, treeless expanse where a man could wander for days without finding a drop of water. It was the heart of the Comanche stronghold. For the first week, the march was a battle against the environment. The streams they crossed were often brackish or dry, the water holes reduced to muddy wallows fouled by buffalo. The men drank the water anyway, straining it through their neckerchiefs to filter out the wigglers and the grit. Dysentery struck quickly. Men rode with cramps knotting their stomachs, unable to stop or rest. The wagons jolted over rough ground, breaking axles and wheels. The blacksmiths and wheelwrights worked through the nights by lantern light to repair the damage, the ring of their hammers echoing in the darkness. Mackenzie pushed the pace. He was not interested in conserving the men's energy. He was interested in closing the distance. He knew that the other columns were moving, and he intended to be the first to strike. He slept little, his insomnia fueled by the pain in his hand and the pressure of command. He rode up and down the line, his sharp voice correcting a loose saddle girth here, a lagging wagon there. He was a presence that could be felt even when he was not seen. The troopers feared him, but they also trusted him. They knew that Bad Hand never lost a fight. He had never been defeated in the field. The column carried with it the latest in military technology. The troopers were armed with the single-shot Springfield Model 1873 carbine, a weapon that fired a .45 caliber cartridge with a 55-grain black powder charge. It was a robust, hard-hitting weapon, though prone to jamming when the copper casings expanded too much in the hot breech. On their hips, they carried the Colt single-action Army revolver, the Peacemaker, a six-shooter that provided close-range firepower. The infantry carried the longer Long Tom Springfield rifles, accurate at ranges that could keep an enemy at bay long before a charge could develop. This firepower gave the column a lethal radius, a zone of death that moved with them across the prairie. As they pushed north, the landscape began to change. The mesquite and scrub brush became sparser. The ground became harder. They were approaching the edge of the world as they knew it. The scouts reported seeing smoke signals on the distant horizons, thin columns of white puffing up into the blue sky and then vanishing. The Comanche knew they were coming. The element of strategic surprise was gone, but the tactical advantage remained. The sheer size of the force was its own message. This was not a patrol that would turn back at the first sign of resistance. This was an invasion. Mackenzie's orders from General Augur were clear. He was to act as a scourge. He was not merely to engage combatants. He was to destroy the infrastructure of the tribes. This meant burning lodges, destroying food stores, and capturing horses. The strategy was one of attrition. The army could not catch every individual warrior on the vast plains, but they could destroy the means of survival. They could make the winter impossible to endure. By early September, the column had covered over 150 miles. The horses were leaner, their ribs showing through their coats. The men were gaunt, their faces burned dark by the sun and wind, covered in layers of dust that turned them into monochromatic statues. Uniforms were patched and repatched. Boots were wearing thin on the abrasive rock. But the column had hardened. The weak had been weeded out or had learned to endure. The unit moved with a singular purpose, a collective will forged by the harsh discipline of their commander. One evening, as the column bivouacked near a small tributary of the Red River, a severe thunderstorm rolled in from the northwest. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in minutes. Rain lashed the camp, turning the dust into a thick, clinging mud that sucked at boots and hooves. The lightning was continuous, illuminating the huddling figures of the men and the frightened eyes of the horses. There was no shelter. The men stood or crouched in the deluge, holding their ponchos tight around them. The thunder was so loud it shook the ground. It felt as if the sky itself was attacking them. Mackenzie refused to let the weather slow them down. The next morning, in the sodden gray dawn, the bugle sounded boots and saddles. The men mounted wet horses in wet clothes. They rode into the mud, the wagons sinking to their axles, requiring double teams of mules and cursing men to pry them free. The relentless forward motion continued. The objective was the double mountain fork of the Brazos River, a staging area from which they would launch their final assault onto the plains. The interaction between the infantry and the cavalry was one of mutual necessity and friction. The Waka heaps, as the cavalry called the foot soldiers, resented the dust kicked up by the horses. The cavalrymen, superior in their saddles, looked down on the plodding infantry. Yet at night, when the perimeter was set, the infantry's long rifles provided the security that allowed the troopers to sleep. The two branches relied on each other to survive the hostile territory. They shared their meager rations, hardtack biscuits so hard they had to be broken with a rifle butt and soaked in coffee, salt pork that was more fat than meat, and beans that were never quite cooked through due to the altitude and lack of good firewood. Mackenzie received couriers from the other columns periodically. Reports came in of skirmishes, of elusive bands of Kiowa slipping through nets, of the difficulties of supply. Colonel Miles was struggling with heat and lack of water to the north. Major Price was delayed by terrain in the west. It became increasingly clear that Mackenzie's column was the hammer that would have to deliver the decisive blow. He was the one closest to the suspected sanctuary of the tribes. The scouts brought word of heavy trails heading west and north, broad swaths of trampled grass where travois poles had dragged. These were not war parties. These were whole villages moving. Families, dogs, spare horses, and years of accumulated possessions were migrating. The Comanche were consolidating. They were moving toward the deep canyons where they believed the army wagons could not follow. They were retreating to the places where their ancestors had wintered for generations. Mackenzie studied the maps, which were largely blank spaces marked unexplored. He relied on his scouts and his own intuition. He knew the Comanche mind. He knew they would seek water and shelter. He looked at the jagged lines that marked the edges of the caprock. Somewhere in that geology lay the key to the campaign. He did not know exactly where Palo Duro Canyon was, but he knew he was hunting it. The psychological pressure on the men increased as they moved deeper into the unknown. They were now hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. If they were defeated, there would be no retreat. If they ran out of water, they would die. The vastness of the landscape made them feel insignificant. The sky was too big, the horizon was too far away. The silence of the plains was heavy, broken only by the jingle of bits and the creak of leather. Every rise in the land could hide an ambush. Every ravine could be a trap. Yet the column marched on. They were an invasive species in this ecosystem, a force of industrial iron intruding on a land of stone and grass. They carried with them the authority of the federal government and the mandate of a nation that had decided there was no longer room for two ways of life. The column was a physical manifestation of that mandate. It was unstoppable, unfeeling, and directed by a single will. As August turned to September, the iron column reached the supply depot established on the fresh fork of the Brazos. Here they regrouped for the final push. They divested themselves of everything non-essential. The wagons that would accompany the strike force were lightened. The men were issued extra ammunition. The sick were left behind with a guard. Mackenzie tightened the coil. He prepared the 4th Cavalry to leave the slow-moving infantry support behind if necessary and strike fast. The departure from the supply base marked the transition from the approach phase to the combat phase. The men checked their weapons with renewed care. They sharpened their sabers, though they rarely used them, preferring the pistol. They tightened the cinches on their saddles. The banter in the ranks died down. The faces of the men grew serious. They knew they were close. The weather began to turn again, the heat of August giving way to the unpredictable storms of September on the high plains. The wind blew constantly, a ceaseless gale that chapped lips and filled eyes with grit. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, and it demanded a harsh, unforgiving response. Mackenzie was ready to give it. He sat by his campfire on the night before the final push, reading a letter from his sister. He held the paper with his damaged hand, the firelight illuminating the deep lines on his face. He finished the letter. folded it carefully and placed it in his tunic pocket. He stood up and walked to the edge of the light, looking north into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Quanah Parker was waiting. Somewhere out there, the final battle for the southern plains was waiting to happen. Mackenzie turned back to his officers and gave the order. At first light, they would ascend the caprock. At first light, they would enter the ocean of grass. September 9th, 1874. The transition from the broken rolling country of the Texas lower plains to the Llano Estacado was not a gradual incline. It was a violent geological interruption, a collision between the earth and the sky. The 4th Cavalry stood at the base of the Caprock Escarpment, a sheer cliff face rising hundreds of feet into the air. It was a fortress wall built by nature to separate the world of men from the world of silence. To the soldiers looking up, the red sandstone and white gypsum layers seemed to support the firmament itself. There were no roads here. There were only ancient, narrow buffalo trails and the steep, treacherous paths worn by centuries of Comanche travel. The order to ascend was given and the struggle against gravity began. The cavalrymen dismounted, leading their horses up the narrow, crumbling ravines. The animals scrambled for footing on the loose scree, their iron shoes striking sparks against the flint and rock. But the true nightmare belonged to the teamsters driving the supply wagons. The mules strained against their collars, their hooves slipping on the slate. Men pushed from behind, their boots sliding in the dirt, their shoulders wedged against the tailgates. Whips cracked like pistol shots in the thin air, cutting through the heavy breathing of the animals. The heavy wagons groaned and lurched, the wood protesting the torsion, threatening to tip backward and crush the men below. It took hours of backbreaking labor to hoist the logistical tail of the army up the vertical face. When the first wagon finally crested the rim, the drivers collapsed in the dirt, chests heaving, lungs burning from the exertion. When the men stood up and looked out, the world had vanished. They had stepped onto the Llano Estacado, the staked plains. It was a landscape that defied the human need for perspective. It was flat, not in the way a meadow is flat, but flat in the way a calm ocean is flat. It stretched in every direction to a seamless horizon, a perfect circle of grass meeting sky. There were no trees, there were no hills, there were no landmarks. A man could turn 360 degrees and see nothing but an endless expanse of short, yellow grama grass and the vast, crushing dome of the blue sky. The psychological impact was immediate. The troopers, used to the comforting claustrophobia of forests or the orienting lines of river valleys, felt suddenly exposed, as if they were standing on a tabletop suspended in the void. The column reformed and began to march north and west, moving deeper into the vacuum. The ocean of grass lived up to its name. The wind blew constantly, a steady, unyielding force that caused the grass to ripple in long, undulating waves that mimicked the sea. The motion was hypnotic. After hours of staring at the shifting ground, men began to feel seasick in their saddles, a vertigo induced by the lack of a static focal point. The visual monotony was absolute. A trooper could ride for 10 hours and feel as if he had not moved a single inch. The horizon never changed. The sun rose from the grass, climbed directly overhead, and sank back into the grass. There was no scenery to mark the passage of time, only the changing angle of the shadows. Colonel Mackenzie understood the danger of this terrain. It was not just the emptiness, it was the lack of reference. The early Spanish explorers had supposedly driven stakes into the ground to mark their path so they could find their way back, giving the region its name. Without landmarks, a man who wandered just a few hundred yards from the column could lose sight of it in the shimmering heat haze and be lost forever. Mackenzie ordered the flankers to stay close. The column tightened. They moved as a single dark scar across the pale face of the plain. The drought that had gripped the region for the summer intensified the hostility of the environment. The lagunas, natural depressions that usually held rainwater, were dry, cracked pans of baked mud. The heat radiating off the ground was ferocious. By mid-morning, the temperature soared. The heat waves distorted the air, creating mirages that tormented the men. Huge lakes of sparkling blue water would appear on the horizon, complete with the reflection of phantom trees. Men would point and shout, their hopes rising, only to watch the water evaporate into dry air as they approached. It was a cruel optical trick that played out dozens of times a day, wearing down the mental fortitude of the young recruits. Water became the only currency of value. The canteens, filled days ago at the fresh streams below the caprock, were now running low. The water inside them was hot, tasting of tin and the wet wool covers. Men rationed themselves, taking only small sips to wet their cracked lips. The physical sensation of thirst became a constant companion. Mouths grew sticky, tongues swelled, and speech became difficult. The horses suffered more. A horse requires gallons of water a day to function, and the dry grass provided no moisture. Their heads drooped. Their gait became shuffling. The dust kicked up by thousands of hooves hung in the air, a choking cloud that coated the inside of mouths and nostrils with a fine, gritty paste. When they did find water, it was often poison. The geology of the Llano was rich in gypsum and alkali. The few sinkholes that held liquid contained a white, milky substance that smelled of sulfur. Desperate men and horses drank it anyway. The result was immediate and violent. The gyp water acted as a powerful purgative. Men were doubled over with stomach cramps, vomiting and suffering from severe diarrhea that dehydrated them further. The horses grew weak, their bowels loose, their flanks trembling. The column left a trail of sickness behind it, the stench of dysentery mixing with the dust. The lack of wood changed the daily rhythm of the soldier's life. There was no fuel for campfires to cook food or boil coffee. The men turned to the only fuel available, buffalo chips. The dried dung of the bison lay scattered across the plains, preserved by the arid air. Troopers spent their evenings walking with sacks, collecting the gray fibrous discs. They burned with a hot, smokeless flame that smelled of burning grass. It was enough to boil a pot of coffee, but it was a humbling reality for men who considered themselves the vanguard of civilization to be cooking their meals over piles of excrement. The food itself was monotonous, hardtack that had to be soaked to be edible, and salt pork that increased their thirst. On the third day of the march across the high plains, the isolation began to fray the nerves of the soldiers. The silence of the Llano was profound. There were no birds, save for the occasional hawk circling high in the thermal currents. There were no crickets. The only sound was the wind and the mechanical noise of the army, the jingle of bridles, the squeak of leather, the clatter of canteens. At night, the silence was even heavier. The stars appeared incredibly close, hanging like lanterns just out of reach. The Milky Way was a solid band of light. Under this immense canopy, the men felt their insignificance. They spoke in hushed tones around the buffalo chip fires. Stories of men going plains crazy circulated. Men who had simply walked away into the nothingness, their minds broken by the lack of boundaries. The equipment began to fail under the strain of the environment. The dry air sucked the moisture out of leather, causing reins and saddles to crack if not constantly oiled. Boots already worn from the march north began to disintegrate on the abrasive sandy soil. The infantrymen wrapped their feet in burlap sacks or strips of raw hide to keep their boots together. Uniforms, once dark blue, were bleached by the sun and stained with sweat and dirt until they were a uniform color of dust. The metal of the weapons was hot to the touch, requiring men to handle their carbines with care during the heat of the day. The scouts ranged far ahead, their job made difficult by the terrain. In the lower country, they could use ridge lines to hide their movements. Here they were visible for miles. They had to rely on the heat shimmer to obscure their forms. They found signs of the Comanche, a discarded moccasin, a pile of ash from a recent fire, the tracks of a travois cutting through the hard turf. The signs were fresh. The tribes were moving across this wasteland as well, heading for the sanctuary of the canyons. The Comanche knew where the sweet water springs were hidden. They knew the secret folds in the land where a man could hide from the wind. The army was chasing ghosts who knew the haunted house better than the intruders did. Mackenzie pushed the column relentlessly. He knew that the Comanche were vulnerable if he could catch them on the open plain, but he also knew they were moving toward the canyons. He had to close the distance before they slipped into the earth. He rode in a buckboard wagon for part of the day, the pain in his ruined leg too intense for the saddle. From the wagon seat, he watched the horizon with a hawk's intensity. He saw the dust clouds in the distance that might be buffalo or might be Indians. He directed the scouts to investigate every anomaly. On September 12th, the column encountered a massive herd of buffalo. It was a remnant of the great southern herd that was being systematically destroyed. Thousands of the shaggy beasts blocked the path of the army. The herd was a moving island of brown fur in the sea of yellow grass. The noise of their grunting and the clacking of their hooves drowned out the wind. The smell was overpowering, a mix of musk, dust, and animal heat. The soldiers had to pause to let them pass. Some of the men fired into the herd, dropping cows for fresh meat. The butchering was done quickly. The raw red meat was a welcome change from the salt pork, even if it had to be cooked over dung fires. The presence of the buffalo was a sign. The Comanche followed the buffalo. If the herd was here, the people were near. As the days ground on, the physical deterioration of the unit became visible. The horses were gaunt, their ribs showing clearly. The troopers' uniforms were covered in a layer of gray dust that made them look like ghosts. Their eyes were red-rimmed from the glare of the sun. Lips were split and bleeding. The romantic image of the cavalry charge was replaced by the gritty reality of endurance. This was a war of walking. It was a war of water discipline. It was a war against the geography itself. Men walked to spare their mounts, their boots wearing thin on the abrasive ground. The infantry marching at the rear suffered the worst of the dust, breathing the clouds kicked up by the cavalry ahead. The nights brought a drop in temperature that chilled the sweat-soaked men to the bone. They slept on the hard ground, wrapped in single blankets. The wind never stopped. It whistled over the sleeping men, tugging at their coverings. Sentries stood guard, staring into the blackness, their imaginations populating the void with creeping warriors. Every rustle of the grass was a potential attack. The tension was constant. Sleep was fitful. Men woke with stiff joints and grit in their eyes, only to face another day of the same endless horizon. By the middle of the month, the scouts reported a change in the terrain ahead. The perfect flatness was beginning to break. Small ravines, or arroyos, began to appear, scarring the surface of the plain. These were the fingers of the great canyons, the drainage systems that fed the rivers far below. The presence of the arroyos meant they were getting close to the edge of the llano. It meant that the ocean of grass was about to give way to the valley of fire. The geological shift brought a change in the vegetation as well. Scrub brush and mesquite began to appear, offering meager shade but tearing at uniforms. One afternoon, the scouts found a small hidden spring in a deep depression. It was a tinaja, a natural rock tank that held rainwater. The water was cool and sweet, protected from the sun by the overhanging rock. The discovery was treated like a miracle. The column halted. The horses were watered in shifts, the men counting the gulps to ensure every animal got a share. The men filled their canteens, savoring the taste of water that didn't burn their throats. It was a brief respite, a moment of grace in a merciless land. The relief on the faces of the men was palpable. The simple act of drinking clean water restored a measure of morale that the sun had stripped away. Mackenzie used the pause to confer with his guides. The Tonkawa scouts pointed north. They spoke of the Big Canyon, the place where the earth opened up. They said the Comanches called it the place of safety. Mackenzie nodded. The direction was set. They would follow the fractures in the earth until they found the main break. The scouts warned that the canyon was not just a hole in the ground, it was a labyrinth, a place where an army could be swallowed whole. The march resumed with a new urgency. The sun beat down, the dust rose, the monotony returned. But now there was a sense of anticipation. The endless horizon was no longer infinite. Somewhere ahead, it ended. Somewhere ahead, the trap was waiting to be sprung. The soldiers checked their weapons, they adjusted their gun belts. The lethargy of the march was replaced by the sharpening focus of the hunt. They began to see more signs of the enemy. Drag marks from lodge poles, the remnants of small camps, the picked clean bones of antelope. The crossing of the Llano Estacado was a feat of logistics and discipline that few other armies could have accomplished. It stripped the men of their illusions. It reduced life to the basics: move, drink, eat, sleep. It bonded the unit in a shared suffering. They had walked across the roof of the world and survived. They had faced the nothingness and not blinked. Now, as the ground began to slope downward, as the grass gave way to rock, they prepared for the violence that waited below the rim. The ocean was behind them. The battle was ahead. Mid-September 1874. While the soldiers of the 4th Cavalry struggled across the waterless expanse of the staked plains, a different reality existed nearly 1,000 feet below the surface of the earth. The Palo Duro Canyon was not merely a geological formation. It was a biological anomaly, a hidden world carved by the prairie dog-town fork of the Red River over millions of years. To the hawk circling in the updrafts, the plains appeared as a flat brown table, suddenly interrupted by a jagged serpentine wound that bled colors of rust, ochre, and violet. Inside this wound, the wind did not howl with the relentless ferocity it possessed on the high flats. Down here, the air was still and smelled of cedar, sage, and wood smoke. The descent from the rim to the floor was a journey through distinct climate zones. On the high rim, the temperature was fierce, exposing any living thing to the direct assault of the sun. As one descended the narrow, twisting trails, the temperature dropped. The vegetation changed from short buffalo grass to prickly pear cactus, then to yucca, and finally on the canyon floor to groves of cottonwood, hackberry, and juniper. The river itself, though low from the drought, was a lifeline. It wound through the canyon bottom, a ribbon of brown water that nourished a strip of deep green grass. For the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne families pouring into the canyon, this green strip was the difference between death and survival. They came in a steady stream, filtering down the goat paths and the few wider trails accessible to horses. The villages were not small, isolated camps. They were massive, mobile cities. The lodges, made of tanned buffalo hides sewn together with sinew and stretched over pine poles, rose from the canyon floor like conical hills. They were arranged in clusters according to band and family affiliations, stretching for miles along the riverbanks. The sheer scale of the gathering was a testament to the pressure the tribes were under. In years past, they might have wintered in smaller, dispersed groups to make foraging easier. Now the threat of the blue-coated soldiers had forced them to consolidate. The Kiowa, led by Mamanti and Lone Wolf, set up their lodges near the confluence of the Sita Canyon. The Cheyennes, weary from months of harassment, camped farther upstream, but the heart of the encampment, the anchor of the resistance, was the Quahati Comanche. They were the antelope eaters, the wildest and most intractable of the Comanche bands, who had never signed a treaty and never lived on a reservation. Their lodges dominated the widest parts of the canyon floor. Iron Shirt, a war chief of immense respect, oversaw the placement of the tepees, ensuring that the most vulnerable, the old and the very young, were placed closest to the canyon walls, protected by the bulk of the warrior societies. The canyon floor became a hive of industry. This was not a place of leisure. It was a factory for winter survival. The women worked from before dawn until after dark. The primary task was food preservation. The buffalo hunt on the journey to the canyon had been successful, and now the meat had to be processed before it spoiled in the heat. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the savory smell of drying meat. Strips of lean muscle hung from wooden drying racks, turning black and hard in the dry air. This jerky would be the staple food for the coming months. Other women worked on the hides. The process was grueling physical labor. A fresh hide weighed over 100 pounds. It had to be staked out on the ground, hair side down. The women used tools made from elk bone or sharpened iron to scrape the flesh and fat from the skin. Once cleaned, the hide was treated with a mixture of brains, liver, and grease to soften the fibers. Then came the breaking, where the skin was pulled back and forth over a rough rope or a smooth rock for hours until it became pliable. Finally, the hides were smoked over low fires of rotten wood to waterproof them. The canyon was filled with the acrid, heavy smoke of the tanning fires, a smell that permeated hair, clothing, and skin. The wealth of the tribes was visible not in gold, but in horseflesh. The horse herd in the canyon was staggering in size. Estimates placed the number at well over 10,000 animals. They covered the canyon floor like a moving carpet, grazing on the rich gamma and blue stem grasses. There were war ponies, painted and scarred. There were pack mules, sturdy and sullen. There were breeding mares and leggy colts. The herd was the source of the tribe's mobility and their tactical advantage. Boys as young as 6 and 7 were tasked with minding the herds, moving them up and down the canyon to fresh pasture, keeping the stallions from fighting and ensuring that no animals strayed up the narrow trails to the rim. The soundscape of the canyon was a chaotic symphony of life. There was the constant barking of hundreds of camp dogs, the whinnying of horses, the shouting of children playing in the river, and the rhythmic thumping of stone mauls pounding choke cherries and meat into pemmican. In the evenings, the sounds of drums and flutes echoed off the canyon walls, the acoustics amplifying the music. It was a sound of defiance. By filling the canyon with life, they were asserting their right to exist. They were proving that they were not yet broken. Despite the labor, there was a pervasive sense of safety. The Palo Duro had served as a sanctuary for generations. The geography itself was their primary defense. The canyon walls rose 800 to 1,000 feet in many places. Sheer cliffs of red sandstone that were unclimbable. There were only a few trails in or out, and these could be easily defended by a handful of riflemen. To the Comanche mind, the canyon was a fortress designed by the spirits. They believed that the white soldiers with their heavy wagons and grain-fed horses could never cross the waterless hell of the Llano Estacado to reach the rim. And even if they did, they would never dare to descend into the teeth of the combined might of the Southern Plains tribes. The warriors spent their days repairing weapons and resting. They sat on buffalo robes in the shade of the cottonwoods, passing pipes and discussing the summer's raids. They sharpened their knives on whetstones. They inspected their supply of ammunition, counting the cartridges for their Winchesters and Spencers. Lead bars were melted down over fires and cast into bullets for the older muzzle loaders. Arrowheads were filed to razor sharpness. They were not complacent, but they were confident. They knew the land and they knew their enemy's limitations. They had outrun the cavalry all summer. Now they believed the season was on their side. Winter was coming and the white man did not fight in the winter. Among the leaders there was a complex political dynamic. Poor Buffalo, a Comanche civil chief, focused on the logistics of the camp, mediating disputes over grazing rights and campsite locations. Lone Wolf of the Kiowa, burning with hatred for the whites who had killed his son and nephew earlier that year, advocated for continued raids even as winter approached. He wanted blood, but others counseled patience. They argued that the wise course was to wait out the winter. Let the soldiers tire themselves out chasing shadows on the plains, and then emerge in the spring strong and rested. The spiritual life of the camp was intense. Medicine men conducted ceremonies to ensure the safety of the people. They consulted the spirits of the coyote and the eagle. They looked for omens in the entrails of slaughtered buffalo. Some preached that the time of the white man was ending, that a great cleansing was coming that would wash the invaders from the land. This messianic fervor had been damaged by the failure at adobe walls, but it was not dead. Desperation fueled belief. The people needed to believe that there was a power greater than the Sharp's rifle and the telegraph. The environment of the canyon was not entirely benign. Rattlesnakes coiled in the rocks, their dry buzz a constant warning to the careless. Flash floods were a known danger. A thunderstorm miles away on the plains could send a wall of water rushing down the canyon floor, sweeping away anything in its path. The people kept a wary eye on the sky, knowing that the trap of the canyon could turn against them if the water rose. But compared to the exposed, coverless expanse of the high plains, these were manageable risks. Food was plentiful for the moment. In addition to the buffalo meat, the canyon offered wild plums, grapes, and hackberries. The women gathered these, drying the fruit or mashing it into the pemmican to provide sugar and vitamins. They dug for roots and tubers in the sandy soil. The feasting was a way to build up layers of fat against the coming cold. Children ran with grease on their chins, their bellies full for the first time in months. The specter of starvation, which always haunted the tribes, had been pushed back to the edges of the firelight. Scouts were posted at the main trailheads leading down from the rim, but the perimeter was vast. It was impossible to guard every inch of the canyon lip, which stretched for tens of miles. The chiefs relied on the sheer improbability of discovery. The plains above were a trackless void. To find the canyon, an enemy would have to stumble upon it. To find the specific location of the villages within the canyon required luck or betrayal. They did not believe the soldiers possessed either. News from the outside world arrived sporadically. Small groups of warriors arriving late brought stories of the columns moving on the plains. They told of the burned grass and the dry water holes. They laughed at the clumsiness of the soldiers, describing the dust clouds that marked their position for 20 miles. They described the waka heaps, the infantry, trudging along in their heavy boots, looking miserable and weak. These reports reinforced the feeling of superiority. The white soldiers were foolish. They fought the land instead of moving with it. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension. The older men, those who remembered the days before the horse soldiers became numerous, sensed a shift. The persistence of the army was new. In the past, the soldiers would campaign for a few weeks and then return to their forts. Now they stayed. They carried their supplies in wagons that seemed to have no bottom. They did not go home when the leaves turned. This Red River War was different. It was total. The objective was not punishment. It was removal. As September waned, the canyon began to dress for autumn. The leaves of the cottonwoods turned a brilliant gold, reflecting the light of the sun against the red walls. The nights grew colder, the air settling into the depression and chilling the skin. The fires burned brighter and longer. Families huddled together under the buffalo robes, the stories of the elders drifting through the smoke-filled air. They told the creation myths. They told of the trickster coyote. They told of the great warriors of the past who had driven the Apache and the Ute from these very hunting grounds. The isolation of the canyon created a psychological bubble. Inside the walls, the old ways were still intact. The hierarchy of the tribe, the roles of men and women, the connection to the earth. Everything functioned as it had for centuries. It was a preserved fragment of a dying world. For the children born during the war, this was likely the first time they had seen their people living as they were meant to live, stationary, secure, and abundant. They played games of kick the ball and practiced with miniature bows, unaware that they were the last generation who would know this freedom. The horse herd required constant management. The grass in the immediate vicinity of the villages was quickly grazed down, forcing the boys to drive the animals further up and down the canyon each day. This daily migration churned the mud of the riverbanks and created a network of trails that paralleled the water. The sheer volume of manure produced by 10,000 horses attracted clouds of flies, a buzzing plague that irritated eyes and crawled on food. It was a gritty, smelly reality, but to the Comanche, the smell of horses was the smell of wealth and power. A man with no horses was nothing. A man with many was a chief. Iron Shirt rode through the camp daily, his eyes missing nothing. He checked the defenses, he spoke with the young men who were eager to slip away and raid the settlements in Texas. He forbade it. This was a time for hiding, not for drawing attention. He knew that a single trail leading back to the canyon could doom them all. He enforced discipline with the authority of his reputation. He wore a coat of mail, ancient armor handed down from Spanish ancestors or captured in some long-forgotten raid, which gave him his name and his mystique. He was the iron anchor of the people. The women continued their work, their hands stained with dye and grease. They made moccasins for the winter, sewing thick soles of rawhide to protect feet from the frozen ground. They repaired the lodge covers, patching holes where the wind might enter. They were the architects of the village, the ones who built the homes and clothed the people. Their chatter filled the air, a constant background noise of gossip, laughter, and instruction. They spoke of marriages and births, of the quality of the berries this year, of the strange behavior of the soldiers. They did not speak of the end. To speak of it was to invite it. The illusion of permanence grew with each passing day. The lodges settled into the earth. Paths were worn between the neighbors. The temporary camp began to feel like a permanent town. The people began to believe that the war had passed them by, that the soldiers had missed their chance. They looked at the red walls and saw protection. They looked at the river and saw life. They did not see that they had walked into a cul-de-sac. They did not see that by concentrating their entire population in one place, they had presented the army with the single target it had been seeking for months. Above them on the high plains, the wind continued to blow, erasing the tracks of the approach. But the scouts of the 4th Cavalry were not looking for tracks in the grass, they were looking for the land itself to break. The canyon was a secret, but it was a secret that could not be kept forever. The smoke from thousands of fires drifted up, a thin haze that dissipated in the strong winds of the rim, but the smell lingered. A sharp-nosed scout, a Tonkawa or a Seminole, could smell hickory smoke and roasting meat from miles away if the wind was right. The sun set on the canyon, plunging the floor into shadow long before the sky above darkened. The transition from day to light was rapid. The temperature plummeted. The frogs in the river began their chorus. The coyotes on the rim began to howl, their voices carrying down into the deep bowl. The people covered their fires to bank the coals for the morning. The canyon slept, a cradle of stone holding the last of the free tribes. It was a fortress, yes, but a fortress with no back door. If the enemy appeared at the gates, there would be nowhere to run but into the walls themselves. The trap was set not by the soldiers but by the geography that the tribes trusted to save them. The sheer volume of life within the canyon walls created a distinct microclimate of sound and smell. As night fully descended, the individual noises merged into a low, collective hum. The thousands of horses shifting their weight and chewing the cud produced a vibration that could be felt through the soles of the moccasins. The dogs curled near the tent flaps occasionally growled at the shadows, their instincts sharper than the men's. The children, exhausted from the day's play, slept deeply under the piles of furs. The adults, however, slept with one ear open, a habit ingrained by years of warfare. In the lodge of Iron Shirt, the chief cleaned his rifle by the light of a small grease lamp. He ran an oiled rag through the barrel, checking the rifling for rust. He was a man of few words, but his thoughts were loud. He knew the vulnerability of their position. He knew that if the soldiers found the rim, they could rain fire down on the lodges with impunity. He had argued for moving the camp further down the canyon, where the walls were less steep and escape routes more plentiful. But the consensus had been to stay near the best water and grass. He holstered the weapon and lay back, listening to the wind sighing through the cottonwoods. It sounded like a voice whispering a warning he could not quite understand. Outside, the sentries walked their rounds. They were young men, eager for glory but bored by the tedium of guard duty. They stopped to chat with one another, sharing tobacco and jokes. They looked up at the rim, a black line against the starry sky. It seemed impenetrable. It seemed like the edge of the world. They did not know that the world was about to come crashing down on them. They did not know that the tracks they had left on the plains were being read like a map. They did not know that the silence of the night was the holding of breath before the scream. The canyon held the people in its rocky embrace, protecting them from the wind but sealing them in with their fate. The water of the Red River flowed on, indifferent to the lives gathered on its banks. It had carved this canyon over eons, wearing down the stone grain by grain. It had seen peoples come and go for thousands of years. The Apache had been here, the Kiowa had been here, and now the Comanche were here. The river knew that nothing in the Yoel Canyon was permanent. The stone endured, but the people were as transient as the leaves falling from the trees. As the moon rose, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon floor, the camp settled into a deep stillness. The fires burned down to glowing red eyes in the darkness. The smoke drifted lazily, pooling in the low spots. It was a scene of perfect pastoral peace. It was the last night of the world as they knew it. The dawn would bring a new era, one of fire and blood. But for now, the canyon was a sanctuary, a hidden fortress where the people could dream of a future that would never come. September 26, 1874. The darkness surrounding the encampment at Tool Canyon was not empty space. It was a solid wall of tension that pressed against the eyes of the sentries. The 4th Cavalry had bivouacked in a defensive square, a formation born of necessity and experience. The men slept with their arms, their carbines tucked under the blankets to keep the dew off the metal. The horses were picket-lined in the center of the square, a mass of nervous muscle and twitching ears. At 10 o'clock at night, the silence of the high plains shattered. A sudden, violent eruption of gunfire and high-pitched screaming tore through the perimeter as a war party of Kiowas, led by the chief Mamanti, launched a furious assault on the horse herd. They rode through the outer pickets, waving buffalo robes and firing rifles into the air, attempting to stampede the cavalry mounts. It was a classic tactic of plains warfare. Strip the enemy of mobility, leave them foot-bound in the desert, and then destroy them at leisure. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie reacted with the cold precision of a machine. He did not panic. He had anticipated this. He ordered the men to stand to, his voice cutting through the confusion. He expressly forbade them from chasing the raiders into the dark. He knew the Kiowa tactics well. The feigned retreat was a lure designed to draw angry, disorganized troopers into the broken terrain of the canyon breaks where they could be isolated and killed. The soldiers knelt in firing lines, the breech blocks of their Springfield carbines snapping shut with a metallic clatter. They waited for the flashes of the enemy guns in the moonlight and then poured disciplined rolling volleys into the darkness. The discipline of the horses, hardened by months of campaigning and the constant proximity of gunfire, held firm. They reared and pulled at their picket ropes, rolling their eyes in terror, but the ropes held and the animals did not break loose. The stampede failed. The skirmish lasted for nearly an hour, a chaotic exchange of lead in the moonlight. Bullets whined overhead or kicked up dirt near the kneeling troopers. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the firing stopped. The Kiowas melted back into the night, leaving behind only the sharp smell of gunpowder and the groans of a few wounded men. Mackenzie kept the regiment on high alert until dawn, refusing to let the men stand down. He knew this attack was not a random encounter or a simple raid for horses. It was a delaying action. The tribes were trying to slow him down, to distract him, to keep him pinned at Tool Canyon while the main body of their families escaped elsewhere. The attack was a confirmation that he was close to the main body. When the sun rose, painting the rugged landscape in harsh relief, Mackenzie ordered the scouts forward. Lieutenant John Bullis gathered his Seminole Negro scouts and the Tonkawa trackers. They moved out on foot, their eyes scanning the ground with forensic intensity. The area around the camp was a mess of hoofprints, a confused script written in the dust by the night's skirmish. But the scouts were looking for something else. They were looking for the back trail of the attackers. They wanted to know where the warriors had come from, believing that the war party would lead them back to the village. Sergeant John Ward, a black Seminole scout known for his uncanny ability to read the earth, found the sign first. It was not a single trail, but a convergence. The tracks of the raiding party led away to the north, but as the scouts followed them, they intersected with something much larger. It was a trail that the soldiers described as looking like a great public highway. It was hundreds of yards wide, a massive swath of trampled earth where thousands of ponies, hundreds of lodge-pole travois, and countless moccasined feet had passed. The grass was beaten flat, pulverized into the soil. The earth was churned into a fine powder by the sheer volume of traffic. It was the trail of a migrating nation. The scouts followed this massive scar across the prairie. It did not head west, deeper into the open plains as Mackenzie had initially feared. It headed north, straight toward the jagged edge of the horizon where the flat tableland broke away. The Tonkawa scouts became animated, their stoic demeanor cracking. They pointed toward the north and spoke the word Palo Duro. They knew this trail. It was the road to the winter sanctuary. The Kiowa raiders at Tool Canyon had made a fatal strategic error. By attacking Mackenzie, they had drawn his attention to their presence, and in retreating they had left a line of breadcrumbs that led directly to their hidden fortress. Mackenzie rode forward to inspect the trail himself. He saw the freshness of the sign. The manure scattered along the path was still moist inside. The edges of the hoofprints were sharp, not yet eroded by the wind. This was not a trail from a week ago. It was a trail from yesterday, perhaps even today. The families were just ahead of him. The realization crystallized his plan. He would not rest. He would not wait for the slow-moving infantry or the supply wagons. He would take the cavalry and strike immediately. He ordered the wagons to remain at Tool Canyon with a strong guard detail. He took the best horses, the fittest men, and loaded them with 3 days of rations, dried beef and hardtack, and full ammunition belts. This was to be a flying column, a strike force designed for speed and violence. The men grumbled as they tightened their saddle girths. They were exhausted from the skirmish the night before. They had not slept in over 24 hours. Their eyes were gritty with fatigue and dust. But the sight of the massive trail energized them. They knew that the months of walking, the thirst, and the boredom were over. The quarry was in front of them. The column moved out in the late afternoon, following the great trail north. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature dropped rapidly. The wind picked up, cutting through the thin wool of the uniforms. Mackenzie pushed the pace. He kept the horses at a steady, ground-eating trot, a pace that covered miles without killing the mounts. He wanted to reach the rim of the canyon before dawn. He wanted to catch the tribes while they were still asleep. Night fell, bringing a suffocating darkness to the high plains. There was no moon in the early evening. The column became a long, clinking snake moving through a void. The only guidance was the trail itself, which was so broad that even in the starlight it appeared as a lighter shade of gray against the surrounding darker grass. The scouts rode far ahead, invisible to the main body, keeping a silent vigil for rear guards or ambushes. The march became a test of endurance. The men dozed in their saddles, waking with a violent start as they slumped forward. Hallucinations born of sleep deprivation began to plague them. Bushes turned into crouching warriors in their peripheral vision. The wind sounded like distant screaming. Officers rode up and down the line, keeping the men awake with low, harsh whispers. "Close up," they hissed, "and keep the interval." The sound discipline was strict. No talking, no smoking. The striking of a match could be seen for miles in the clear air. The clatter of a canteen against a saddle ring sounded like a church bell in the silence. The horses, sensing the urgency or perhaps smelling the water of the distant river, kept moving. They were tired, their heads bobbing with every step, but they followed the herd instinct. The column covered mile after mile of the flat, featureless plain. To the soldiers, it felt as if they were marching on a treadmill, the ground moving beneath them but the destination never arriving. The phantom trail stretched on, a road to nowhere. The dust kicked up by the column hung low, choking the men in the rear. Around midnight, the scouts halted. Lieutenant Bullis rode back to the main column to find Mackenzie. He reported that the trail was getting fresher. They had found a discarded copper kettle, then a lame horse that had been abandoned only hours before. The enemy was close. Mackenzie nodded in the dark. He ordered the column to halt for a brief rest. The men dismounted and stood by their horses. They did not unsaddle. They chewed on hardtack and took sips from their canteens. The silence was absolute. 600 men and horses stood on the prairie, and the only sound was the wind in the grass and the heavy breathing of the animals. The rest was short, barely enough to loosen stiff muscles. Mackenzie ordered them back into the saddle. The march resumed. The moon rose, a sliver of silver that provided just enough light to see the man in front. The landscape began to change slightly. The ground became rougher, broken by small drainage heads and sudden dips. The scouts knew what this meant. They were approaching the drainage of the Red River. They were approaching the rim. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the scouts stopped again. This time, their behavior was different. They were crouching low to the ground, signaling frantically for the column to stop. Mackenzie rode forward, his horse's hooves muffled by the thick grass. He joined Bullis and the Tonkawa chief Johnson at the edge of a precipice. The world simply ended. They stood on the very lip of the Palo Duro canyon. In the darkness, the canyon was a vast, yawning abyss of blacker than black shadow. It stretched out to the left and right as far as they could see, a tear in the earth that swallowed the starlight. But it was not the sight that arrested them. It was the sound. Drifting up from the depths carried on the thermal currents was the smell of wood smoke, and mixed with the smoke was the faint rhythmic thumping of drums and the distant tinny barking of dogs. Mackenzie dismounted and crept to the very edge. He peered down into the void. As his eyes adjusted to the contrast, he saw tiny pinpricks of light far below, hundreds of them. They were the cooking fires of the villages. The sheer number of them took his breath away. The intelligence reports had been wrong. This was not a small band of holdouts. This was the main gathering. The scouts estimated there were huge numbers of lodges down there. The noises of the herd drifted up, the whinny of horses, thousands of them creating a low, constant rumble like distant thunder. The discovery was a shock. The soldiers had expected to find a camp, but they had found a city. The canyon floor was teeming with the enemy. If the tribes knew the soldiers were there, they could trap the cavalry against the rim and slaughter them with plunging fire. But the element of surprise seemed to be intact. The noises below were the noises of a camp at rest, not a camp in alarm. The Kiowa raiders who had attacked at Tule Canyon had likely ridden in, boasted of their victory, and gone to sleep, believing the soldiers were licking their wounds 20 miles to the south. Mackenzie pulled back from the rim. He called his officers together in a tight circle. The plan had to be executed instantly. There could be no waiting for daylight to reconnoiter. They had to go down now in the dark. The scouts had found a narrow, precipitous trail leading down the cliff face. It was little more than a goat path, terrifyingly steep and narrow. It would force the men to lead their horses in single file. If the Indians discovered them while they were strung out on the canyon wall, the 4th Cavalry would be annihilated. The colonel looked at his men. They were gray with dust and exhaustion. They had marched over 25 miles since the skirmish at Tule Canyon, on top of days of hard riding. But the adrenaline of the discovery was acting as a stimulant more powerful than coffee. They checked their weapons one last time. They tightened their cinches. They looked at the black hole they were about to enter. There was no fear in their eyes, only a grim, professional resolve. They were the tip of the spear, and they had finally found the heart of the enemy. Mackenzie gave the order in a whisper. Prepare to descend. The first company moved forward, the troopers dismounting and grabbing the reins of their horses close to the bit. The first man stepped over the edge and disappeared into the shadows. The horse hesitated, smelling the danger, then slid its hooves forward, committing to the descent. One by one, the troopers followed, a long, thin line of blue pouring into the red earth. The descent was a nightmare of physics. The trail was loose shale and rock. A slip meant a fall of hundreds of feet. The horses slid on their haunches, sending showers of stones clattering down the slope. Every rock that fell sounded like a gunshot to the nervous soldiers. They paused, listening for the alarm cry from below. But the drums continued. The dogs continued to bark at the moon, ignoring the noise from the cliffs. The wind masked the sound of the invasion. As the soldiers descended, the air grew warmer. They were leaving the chill of the high plains and entering the sheltered microclimate of the canyon. The smell of the village became stronger. The scent of curing hides, of roasting meat, of human waste, and the overwhelming musk of the horse herd. It was a sensory overload after the sterile emptiness of the Llano Estacado. The men could hear individual voices now, the laughter of a late-night gambler, the cry of a baby. It was intimate and terrifying. They were descending into the bedroom of their enemy. Mackenzie rode near the front, his bad hand gripping the reins, his eyes fixed on the darkness below. He was gambling everything on this descent. He was violating standard military doctrine by attacking a superior force in a fortified position without a secure line of retreat. But he knew his enemy. He knew that panic was the greatest weapon he possessed. If he could get enough men to the floor before the alarm was raised, the shock would shatter the Comanche resistance. The sky to the east began to lighten, a faint band of gray touching the horizon. The timing was razor thin. They needed the light to shoot, but they needed the darkness to hide their arrival. The long line of soldiers snake-walked down the wall, suspended between the sky and the earth. They were a phantom army appearing out of nowhere, following a phantom trail that had led them to the very edge of hell. The physical strain on the men was immense. Their calves burned from the effort of breaking their descent. Their boots skidded on the loose rock. Horses jostled against them, threatening to knock them off the narrow ledge. One trooper's horse slipped, its hind legs going over the edge. For a heart-stopping moment, the animal scrambled, hooves striking sparks before regaining its footing. The trooper calmed the beast with a hand over its muzzle, his own heart pounding against his ribs. As the lead scouts reached the bottom of the trail, they stepped onto the grassy floor of the canyon. They spread out, silent as ghosts, securing a perimeter for the rest of the column to form up. They were inside the fortress. The lodges of the nearest village were only a few hundred yards away, silent and still. The inhabitants were sleeping, secure in the belief that the canyon walls protected them from the world. They did not know that the world had just climbed down the wall. The trap was set. The hammer was pulled back. And as the first rays of the sun touched the red rim far above, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon was seconds away from exploding. The air was heavy and still, a stark contrast to the wind-scoured plains they had left behind. The canyon floor was not an open parade ground. It was a tangled maze of terrain features. The river wound through the center, its banks choked with tall grass that reached the stirrups of a mounted man. There were ravines, washes, and clumps of cedar that broke up the line of sight. Mackenzie knew that once the shooting started, command and control would be difficult. He needed to form a solid front before they advanced. He moved among the men, his voice a low rasp, ordering them to tighten their girths and mount up as soon as they reached the level ground. The flying column was reassembling itself bone by bone. By 5:30 in the morning, the sky began to bleed a lighter shade of purple in the east. The darkness that had shielded their descent was dissolving. 3 companies were fully down and mounted. The remaining companies were still on the wall, a vulnerable ribbon of blue wool exposed against the red rock. Mackenzie could not wait for the entire regiment to descend. The risk of discovery grew with every passing second. The morning mist was lifting from the river, revealing the silhouette of the nearest lodges less than half a mile away. The village belonged to the Kiowa chief Lone Wolf, situated at the far northern end of the encampment. Further down the canyon lay the lodges of the Comanche, stretching for miles. The sheer size of the target was daunting. There were not just hundreds of warriors here. There were thousands of non-combatants, thousands of horses, and a labyrinth of defensive positions among the rocks and trees. If the tribes realized how few soldiers were currently on the floor, they could counterattack and pin the 4th Cavalry against the cliff. The only option was aggression. Mackenzie signaled for the advance. The scouts, under Lieutenant Bullies, fanned out in a skirmish line ahead of the main body. They moved silently through the tall grass, their weapons held at the ready. Behind them, the cavalry advanced in a column of 4s, the horses stepping high through the brush. The silence was eerie. The village was waking up. A dog barked, a sharp, repetitive sound that echoed off the walls. Then another joined in. A horse whinnied from the herd. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the riverbank ahead. It was a young Indian boy, perhaps 15 years old, walking toward the herd to catch a pony for the day. He stopped, freezing, as he saw the line of blue-coated soldiers emerging from the mist like spirits. For a second, there was no movement. Then the boy turned and ran, his voice shattering the morning calm with a high, piercing yell of alarm. "Tejanos! Tejanos!" The cry acted as a detonator. The sleeping village erupted. Flaps of the teepees were thrown back and warriors spilled out, naked or wrapped in blankets, clutching their Winchesters and bows. Women grabbed children and ran for the rocks at the base of the canyon walls. The confusion was absolute. They had believed themselves safe. They had believed the soldiers were days away. Now the enemy was in their midst. Mackenzie did not hesitate. He shouted the order to charge. "Gallop! March!" The bugler sounded the charge, the brass notes cutting through the cool air. The discipline of the stealth approach vanished, replaced by the thunder of 1,200 hooves pounding the earth. The troopers spurred their mounts, raising a wall of dust as they surged forward. The skirmish line of scouts opened fire, the crack of their rifles mixing with the roar of the advance. The Kiowas in Lone Wolf's village fought a desperate delay action to buy time for their families to escape. Warriors took cover behind rocks, trees, and the lodges themselves, firing back at the oncoming wave of blue. But the momentum of the cavalry was irresistible. The soldiers swept through the first cluster of lodges, firing from the saddle with their revolvers. The structures were empty. The inhabitants had fled into the broken ground of the canyon walls. The goal was not to occupy the lodges, but to drive the warriors away from them and capture the horse herd. The herd was the prize. Without horses, the Comanche and Kiowa were destitute. As the cavalry pressed forward, the immense herd of Indian ponies began to panic. They stampeded down the canyon, a terrifying river of horseflesh that crashed through the brush and splashed across the river, adding to the chaos. Company E, under Captain Boehm, veered to the right, riding hard to cut off the retreat of the pony herd. They rode through a hail of gunfire coming from the high rocks. The warriors had quickly recovered from the initial shock and were scrambling up the canyon walls to take positions on the rim rock and the ledges. From these elevated positions, they began to pour a plunging fire down upon the troopers. Bullets kicked up spurts of red dust around the horses' hooves. A trooper from Company A grunted and slumped forward in his saddle, clutching his shoulder. A horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider into the path of the following ranks. The column split, flowing around the fallen man like water around a stone. There was no stopping. To stop was to die. Mackenzie directed the battle from the front. He saw that the village was not a single entity, but a series of camps separated by open ground and timber. As they cleared Lone Wolf's village, they came into sight of the next one, and the next. The canyon floor was a continuous target. The resistance stiffened as they pushed deeper. The warriors who had fled the first village were now joined by those from the camps further down. They were rallying. The Cheyennes, led by Poor Buffalo and Iron Shirt, were establishing a defensive line in the rocks ahead. They were excellent skirmishers, using the terrain to their advantage. They fired and moved, flanked and retreated, drawing the soldiers deeper into the trap. The canyon walls, once a source of security for the tribes, were now becoming a fortress for the defense. The warriors climbed higher, some reaching positions 500 or 600 feet up the walls, firing down with long-range buffalo rifles. The cavalry found themselves in a crossfire. Bullets struck the ground from the front and from both sides. Mackenzie realized he could not simply ride through the entire encampment. He had to dismount his men and fight on foot. He signaled for the "prepare to fight on foot" order. "Number 4 men, hold horses!" The order rippled down the line. Every 4th trooper stayed mounted and grabbed the reins of 3 other horses. The other 3 swung down, unlimbering their carbines. This reduced the effective fighting force by 25%, but it allowed the men to take cover and return fire with accuracy. A skirmish line was formed, stretching across the canyon floor from wall to wall. The men advanced in short rushes, firing, reloading, and moving forward. The noise in the canyon was deafening. The enclosed space amplified the report of the firearms until it was a solid roar. The smoke from the black powder hung low in the stagnant air, creating a fog of war that obscured targets. Through the haze, the soldiers could see the flashes of the enemy rifles high up in the rocks. They aimed at the smoke, firing blindly into the crevices. As the sun finally crested the rim, it illuminated the scene in stark detail. The beautiful red walls of the canyon were dotted with puffs of white smoke. The green valley floor was swarming with blue uniforms and panicked horses. The colorful lodges stood abandoned, their flaps flapping in the breeze, silent witnesses to the violence. The rear guard of the regiment was still descending the trail during the opening phase of the battle. They could hear the battle raging below them as they navigated the treacherous path. The urgency to join the fight made them reckless. Men ran down the slopes dragging their horses. Some horses lost their footing and tumbled down the scree slopes, crashing into the brush below. The regiment was funneling into the fight, feeding the line as fast as gravity would allow. The Comanche tactic was to separate the soldiers from their horses. If they could kill the holders or stampede the cavalry mounts, the soldiers would be stranded on foot in the middle of hostile territory. Warriors targeted the number 4 men, sending a concentrated fire toward the clusters of led horses. The animals plunged and reared, terrified by the noise and the smell of blood. The holders struggled to control them, cursing and pulling on the leathers, knowing that if they lost the horses, the battle was lost. Mackenzie saw the danger. He ordered Company Wine to secure the rear and protect the LED horses. He pushed the skirmish line forward, driving the warriors back from the river and the timber. The advance was slow and brutal. The soldiers had to check every ravine, every clump of brush. A warrior could be hiding 5 feet away in the tall grass. One incident illustrated the close-quarters nature of the fight. A trumpeter moving through a stand of plum thickets stumbled upon a Kiowa warrior who had been wounded in the leg. The warrior, unable to run, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet knocked the trumpet from the soldier's hand, denting the brass. The soldier drew his revolver and fired 3 times, ending the engagement instantly. There was no time for prisoners. There was no time for hesitation. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the 4th Cavalry had secured the first 2 villages and captured a significant portion of the horse herd. But the battle was far from over. The main body of the Comanche warriors had taken up strong positions on the Red Bluff, a prominent geological feature that dominated the canyon floor. From this high ground, they pinned down the advancing companies. The heat began to rise. The exertion of the climb and the fight left the men drenched in sweat. Canteens were already running dry. The dust from the stampeding herd coated everything in a red film. Faces were masks of grime, eyes white and staring. The initial shock of the assault had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of an infantry fight in difficult terrain. Mackenzie stood near the river, watching the progress of the skirmish line. He was calm, his face set in a grim mask. He knew that he had to dislodge the warriors from the Red Bluff before he could destroy the villages. He turned to Lieutenant Thompson. "Take your men and sweep that ridge," he said, pointing to a steep, rocky outcropping on the left flank. "If they hold that ground, they can cut us to pieces." Thompson nodded and rallied his platoon. They began to climb the slope, moving from rock to rock, firing upward. The warriors on the ridge saw them coming and directed a withering fire downward. The bullets chipped the stone and whined off the rocks. It was a vertical assault, a battle of inches. The vertical mile was no longer just the descent into the canyon. It was the struggle to control the vertical space of the battlefield. The Comanches owned the walls. The cavalry owned the floor. The space in between was the killing zone. The air was filled with lead. The canyon, which had been a place of sanctuary only hours before, had become a crucible. The soldiers pushed on, driven by the discipline drilled into them on the parade grounds of Fort Concho. They did not retreat. They fired, worked the levers of their carbines, and stepped forward. They stepped over the bodies of dead ponies. They stepped past the abandoned toys of children dropped in the flight. They were a machine of destruction grinding its way through the heart of the Comanche nation. As the morning wore on, the sheer weight of the cavalry's firepower began to tell. The Springfield carbines, despite their tendency to jam when hot, had a longer range and a faster rate of fire than most of the trade guns used by the warriors. The volume of fire suppressed the enemy, forcing them to keep their heads down. This allowed the troopers to maneuver, to flank the positions, to keep moving forward. The noise of the battle echoed up to the rim, where the rear guard was finally clearing the trail. To the men still on the high plains, it sounded like a continuous roll of thunder trapped in the earth. They hurried to the edge, looking down into the smoke-filled abyss. They saw the tiny blue figures moving through the grass. They saw the thousands of horses swirling like water. They saw the end of the old way of life playing out in miniature far below. Mackenzie watched his men take the lower slopes of the red bluff. He saw the warriors pulling back, retreating higher into the rocks. The floor was his. Now began the work of destruction. He looked at the miles of lodges stretching out before him. It would take all day to burn them. It would take a hard heart to finish what they had started. But he had his orders. The sanctuary was breached. The hidden fortress was fallen. The vertical mile had been crossed, and there was no going back. The sun cleared the eastern rim of the canyon, transforming the gloom of dawn into a stark, unforgiving daylight. The optical trick of the early morning, where shadows hid the severity of the terrain, was gone. The Palo Duro Canyon was now illuminated in high definition, revealing the tactical nightmare facing both the invaders and the defenders. The heat began to build instantly, radiating off the red sandstone walls and rising from the canyon floor to create a convection oven. The air, already thick with the sulfurous stench of black powder, became heavy and difficult to breathe. The noise was no longer a series of individual shots, but a continuous rolling roar that slammed against the cliffs and rebounded, doubling its intensity until it felt as if the earth itself was splitting apart. The skirmish line of the 4th Cavalry, stretching nearly a mile across the canyon floor, moved forward with a mechanical grimness. The tall grass, which had appeared lush and green from the rim, was a tangle of dry stalks and hidden depressions that snagged boots and tripped horses. The troopers on foot advanced in short, breathless rushes. They would sprint 10 yards, drop to one knee, fire a round from their Springfield carbines, and then reload. The mechanics of the Springfield required a deliberate rhythm. Half-cock the hammer, flip the breech block up, extract the spent casing, insert a fresh 45-70 cartridge, snap the block shut, full cock, aim, and fire. In the heat of the fight, with adrenaline shaking their hands, men fumbled cartridges, dropping them into the dirt. A jammed extractor meant a soldier had to pry the hot brass out with a knife while bullets whipped past his ears. The copper casings of the ammunition expanded in the hot breaches, causing jams that turned the single-shot carbines into clubs until the obstruction was cleared. Facing them was a defensive force that fought with the desperation of men protecting their families. The Comanches and Kiowas had recovered from the initial shock of the surprise attack. They utilized every fold of the ground, every boulder, and every clump of cedar as a fortress. They did not fight in European formations. They fought as individuals or small clusters of relatives moving fluidly through the brush. Their weaponry was a chaotic mix. Some carried modern Winchester repeating rifles bought from Comancheros on the plains. These guns could fire rapidly, creating a volume of lead that forced the soldiers to keep their heads down. Others fired older muzzle loaders or trade muskets, which belched thick clouds of white smoke. A few, lacking ammunition, used bows, launching arrows in high arcs that fell silently into the cavalry ranks. Chief Ironshirt, the Cheyenne war leader, became the anchor of the defense. He moved along the base of the canyon walls, rallying the younger warriors who were wavering under the disciplined volleys of the soldiers. Ironshirt wore his namesake armor, a vest of old leather that had been in his family for generations. The leather fringe clinked softly as he ran. He did not seek cover. He stood in the open, pointing out targets, his presence a visible defiance of the white man's bullets. To the warriors he appeared invulnerable. His calmness was contagious. He directed the fire toward the officers, knowing that killing the leaders would stall the advance. The battle had devolved into a series of vicious close-quarter engagements. The village was not a singular block of housing, but a sprawling collection of neighborhoods separated by the winding river and groves of cottonwood trees. As the soldiers cleared one cluster of lodges, they would immediately come under fire from the next. The fighting was house to house, or rather lodge to lodge. A trooper from Company H kicked open the flap of a teepee, revolver drawn, only to find it empty, the cooking fire still smoking in the center. A moment later, a shot rang out from the brush behind the lodge, and the trooper crumpled, shot through the thigh. The river itself, the Prairie Dog Town Fork, became a contested boundary. The water was shallow, barely ankle-deep in places, but the banks were steep and muddy. Soldiers slid down the embankments, their boots sucking in the red clay to use the riverbed as a trench. Warriors on the opposite bank fired down into the water. The brown stream was churned by boots and hooves, turning a reddish brown that had nothing to do with the clay. Bodies of horses that had been hit in the initial charge lay in the water, creating dams that pooled the flow. The water turned fetid quickly, contaminated by blood and the churned mud, yet men dipped their hats into it to cool their heads. While Iron Shirt held the low ground, the civil chief Poor Buffalo managed the exodus of the non-combatants. This was the true tragedy of the morning. Behind the line of fighting men, thousands of women, children, and elderly people were scrambling up the canyon walls. They sought the goat paths, narrow fissures in the rock that led to the high rim. It was a scene of absolute panic. Mothers carried infants on their backs, their hands gripping the sharp rock, pulling themselves up foot by foot. Old women, too frail to climb, were pushed and pulled by their relatives. They abandoned everything. Heaps of buffalo robes, winter clothing, dried meat, and family heirlooms were dropped on the trail to lighten the load. The soldiers could see the movement on the walls. The brightly colored blankets of the women stood out against the red rock. Lieutenant Thompson, commanding a platoon near the left wall, ordered his men to fire at the movement. He did not distinguish between warrior and woman. In the smoke and distance, a figure moving on the heights was a threat. Bullets chipped the stone around the climbing families, sending showers of razor-sharp fragments into their faces. A woman, struck by a stray round, lost her grip and fell backward, tumbling down the scree slope until she came to rest in the brush at the bottom. The wailing of the women mixed with the crack of the rifles, creating a dissonant soundtrack to the slaughter. Mackenzie rode through the center of the fight, his horse dancing sideways as bullets struck the ground near its hooves. He was frustrated by the pace. The defense was stiffer than he had anticipated. The warriors were not running, they were holding. He saw that the key to the battle lay in a specific geological feature, a high, rocky mesa jutting out from the canyon wall known as the Red Bluff. From this elevated position, Comanche marksmen were pouring a plunging fire into the flanks of the advancing companies. It was a natural machine gun nest, commanding the killing field below. "Clear that bluff!" Mackenzie shouted to Captain Gunther. "They are pinning us down!" Gunther rallied Company H. They turned their attention from the lodges to the heights. The ascent was brutal. The soldiers had to climb while firing. They scrambled over boulders, using the rocks for cover. The warriors on the top had the advantage of gravity. They rolled heavy stones down the slope, which crashed through the brush, smashing limbs and crushing rifles. A sergeant took a bullet in the chest and rolled 50 feet down the hill. The others kept climbing. It was a contest of wills. The soldiers, trained to obey orders without question, advanced into the teeth of the fire. The warriors, fighting for the survival of their people, refused to yield the high ground. In the midst of the fighting, the destruction of the village began. The soldiers realized that they could not occupy the vast encampment. Their orders were to destroy the infrastructure of the tribes. As a company cleared a section of lodges, the order was given to put them to the torch. Soldiers pulled burning sticks from the cooking fires and touched them to the dry buffalo hides of the teepees. The effect was immediate. The greased hides caught fire explosively. Great columns of black, oily smoke spiraled into the sky, joining the white smoke of the gunpowder. The lodges were filled with the wealth of the southern plains. Inside were piles of beautifully tanned buffalo robes, ready for the winter trade. There were bags of flour and sugar, kegs of gunpowder, and cases of ammunition. There were silver-mounted bridles, beaded moccasins, and cradles waiting for babies. All of it fed the flames. The sound of the fire was a roaring background noise, a furnace consuming the culture of a nation. Cans of black powder left inside the lodges cooked off in the heat, exploding with dull thuds that scattered burning debris across the battlefield. The looting was impulsive and chaotic. A soldier seeing a silver bridle would grab it and hang it from his saddle, only to discard it 10 minutes later when the fighting intensified. Another would stuff a beaded pouch into his tunic. They were destroying what they could not carry. The destruction was strategic. Mackenzie knew that a Comanche warrior without a home, without food, and without a horse was no longer a warrior. He was a refugee. He ordered the destruction of everything. Cast iron pots were smashed with rocks. Sacks of flour were slit open and dumped into the dirt. The battle raged for 4 hours without pause. The sun climbed toward its zenith, baking the canyon floor. The temperature surpassed 90 degrees. Thirst became a torture. The soldiers had emptied their canteens hours ago. The river was right there, but to stop and drink was to invite a bullet. Men licked their cracked lips, their tongues swelling in their mouths. The dust kicked up by the movement of thousands of feet hung in the air, coating the throat and lungs. Spittle turned to red mud. On the far right flank, the Seminole Negro scouts were engaged in a vicious duel with a group of Kiowas hiding in a cedar brake. The scouts, masters of irregular warfare, moved silently, flanking the position. Sergeant John Ward crawled on his belly through the cactus, getting within 20 yards of the enemy. He rose suddenly, firing his carbine from the hip. The Kiowas, surprised by the closeness of the attack, broke and ran. The scouts pursued, their blood up, firing into the retreating backs. The medical situation was grim. The regimental surgeon, Dr. Rufus York, set up a field hospital behind a large rock formation near the river. There were no tents, no sterile instruments. He worked in the dirt, cutting uniforms away from wounds, probing for bullets with his fingers. The wounded lay in the shade of the rocks, groaning for water. There was no morphine to spare. A trooper with a shattered knee bit down on a leather strap while the doctor worked. The flies, attracted by the blood, swarmed over the wounded, adding to the misery. By noon, the soldiers had pushed the defensive line back nearly 2 miles. The canyon floor behind them was a wasteland of smoldering ruins and dead animals. But the resistance at the Red Bluff remained obstinate. The warriors there, protected by the rock rim, continued to harass the troops. It was a stalemate in that sector. The soldiers could not advance further without taking unbearable casualties from the flank fire. Iron Shirt saw the shift in the battle. He knew they could not hold the floor indefinitely. The soldiers were too numerous, their firepower too disciplined. His goal now was to buy enough time for the families to reach the high rim. He ordered his men to fall back slowly, trading space for time. They moved from rock to rock, firing, reloading, and moving again. It was a fighting retreat, executed with skill. They left no wounded behind. If a warrior fell, 2 others would drag him to safety. The sheer volume of ammunition expended was staggering. The 4th Cavalry fired thousands of rounds that morning. The canyon floor was littered with brass casings glinting in the sun like gold coins. The Air was so thick with lead that twigs were clipped from the trees and leaves drifted down like green snow. It was truly a valley of fire. There was no safe place. A ricochet off a canyon wall could kill a man just as dead as a direct hit. Mackenzie halted the main line to regroup. The horses were blown, their sides heaving, white lather staining their coats. The men were near collapse. He needed to consolidate his gains before pushing the final few miles. He looked back at the devastation he had wrought. Pillars of smoke marked the locations of the villages like grim milestones. He had burned the heart out of the winter camp. But the horse herd remained a problem. While many had been captured, hundreds more were scattered in the side canyons. And the warriors on the heights were still a threat. If they could regroup and counterattack while the soldiers were disorganized by fatigue, the victory could turn into a massacre. Mackenzie knew he had to break the will of the enemy completely. He had to take the Red Bluff. He turned to his adjutant. "Tell the company commanders to prepare for a final assault," he rasped, his voice wrecked by smoke and shouting. "We clear the heights or we die in this hole." The soldiers checked their weapons. They poured the last grains of powder into their chambers. They looked up at the red rocks, shimmering in the heat. They knew what was coming. The morning had been a slaughter. The afternoon would be a reckoning. The Valley of Fire had not yet claimed its full toll. The battle for the soul of the southern plains was entering its final, most brutal phase. The relentless hammer of the U.S. Army had struck the anvil of the Comanche resistance, and the sparks were burning the world down. The assault on the Red Bluff began with a deception. Mackenzie sent a small detachment of men to the left, firing loudly and making a show of advancing up the sheer face. It was a suicidal angle, and the warriors on the heights concentrated their fire on this group. Meanwhile, the main assault force, led by Captain Gunther, slipped through a ravine to the right, using the dead ground to mask their approach. They climbed hand over hand, hauling themselves up the sandstone ledges. The noise of the distraction covered the sound of their boots on the rock. When they crested the ridge, the combat was immediate and personal. There was no time to reload. Soldiers used their carbines as clubs. They drew their knives. The warriors, surprised on their flank, fought back with tomahawks and war clubs. It was a brawl on the edge of a cliff. Men grappled and rolled in the dirt, seeking an advantage. A trooper kicked a warrior in the chest, sending him stumbling back over the rim to fall hundreds of feet to the canyon floor. The taking of the Red Bluff broke the back of the resistance in that sector. The warriors, seeing their strong point fallen, began to melt away. They retreated up the side canyons, seeking the trails that would take them to the open plains. They abandoned the defense of the villages to save themselves. The firing began to slacken, replacing the roar of battle with the crackle of the burning lodges. Mackenzie stood on the captured heights, looking down at the destruction. The valley was a smoking ruin. The beautiful green oasis was now a blackened scar. The bodies of horses and men lay scattered in the grass. He had won the ground, but the cost was high. The physical toll on his men was immense. They had marched all night and fought all day. They were ghosts in blue uniforms, standing amidst the wreckage of a civilization. The victory was not in the number of enemies killed. The body count was surprisingly low given the volume of fire. The victory was in the destruction of the sanctuary. The winter supplies were gone. The shelter was gone. The sense of safety was gone. The psychological impact was far greater than the tactical one. The Comanches had believed that the Palo Duro was inviolate. Mackenzie had proven that there was no place on earth the cavalry could not reach. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows once again, the soldiers descended from the heights to finish the work of destruction. They moved through the remaining lodges, methodically burning everything. They slaughtered the dogs that had been left behind. They smashed the pottery. It was a scorched earth policy carried out with industrial efficiency. The Valley of Fire had consumed the past. The future for the tribes was now a blank, terrifying void. The afternoon sun transformed the Duro canyon into a crucible of shimmering heat and violence. While the primary villages on the canyon floor had been overrun and set ablaze, the battle had not ended. It had merely migrated vertically. The initial success of the 4th Cavalry in clearing the lodges had pushed the Comanche and Kiowa warriors out of the river bottoms, but it had not broken their resistance. Instead, it had forced them into the terrain that favored them most. The warriors retreated to the Red Bluff, a massive, jagged promontory that jutted out from the canyon wall like the prow of a battleship, dominating the lower crossings of the Prairie Dogtown Fork. From this elevated fortress and the chaotic network of side canyons and rim rocks surrounding it, they established a firing line that brought the cavalry advance to a grinding, bloody halt. The tactical deadlock that ensued was brutal and demoralizing. The soldiers, exhausted from the night march and the morning's fighting, found themselves pinned down in the open. The cover that had served them well in the timber was useless against an enemy firing from 300 feet above. Bullets rained down with terrifying randomness. A trooper crouching behind a dead horse for protection from the front was struck in the back by a round fired from the high rim behind him. The geometry of the canyon created a kill box where there were no safe angles. The air was filled with the angry hornet buzz of lead ricocheting off the sandstone, sending razor-sharp rock splinters flying into faces and eyes. Colonel Mackenzie recognized the danger immediately. The Red Bluff was not just a defensive position, it was the hinge of the entire engagement. As long as the Quahati sharpshooters held that rock, the cavalry could not effectively gather the immense horse herd or finish the destruction of the winter stores without taking unacceptable casualties. The bluff allowed the warriors to enfilade the cavalry lines, raking them from the flank. The volume of fire coming from the heights was intense, a continuous crackle of Winchesters and heavy buffalo rifles that echoed off the opposite walls, making it sound as if the regiment was surrounded by a force 10 times its actual size. The heat became a secondary enemy, almost as lethal as the Comanche bullets. It was now 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The temperature in the breathless canyon bottom soared past 90 degrees. The red rocks absorbed the solar radiation and radiated it back, creating a stifling oven effect. The soldiers were parched, their canteens were dry. The river water, churned into a red slurry of mud and blood, was undrinkable. Men began to suffer from heat exhaustion. Their faces turned beet red, then gray. They vomited dryly in the dust. The wool uniforms designed for cooler climates felt like lead weights. Yet they could not remove them, for the heavy cloth offered the only protection against the thorny mesquite and the abrasive rock. Captain Eugene Beaumont, commanding Company A, found his men bogged down in a shallow ravine beneath the bluff. They were unable to move forward or backward. Every time a soldier raised his head to fire, a flurry of shots from the heights drove him back down. The warriors on the bluff were firing with remarkable accuracy, accounting for the wind and the steep angle. They targeted the officers and the sergeants, trying to decapitate the command structure. Beaumont moved along the line, crawling on his hands and knees, urging his men to conserve their ammunition and fire only at visible targets. The discipline of the troops was fraying under the relentless strain of the plunging fire. The deadlock was psychological as well as physical. The soldiers felt trapped. They were at the bottom of a hole, looking up at an enemy they could barely see. The Comanches, conversely, felt the surge of confidence that comes with holding the high ground. They taunted the soldiers in Spanish and broken English, their voices carrying clearly in the stillness between volleys. They waved blankets and shields, daring the blue coats to come up and fight them man to man. Iron Shirt was visible on the skyline, moving between the rocks, directing the defense. He knew that if they could hold the bluff until dark, they could slip away with their families or perhaps even launch a counterattack that would drive the exhausted soldiers into the river. Mackenzie knew he had to break the stalemate. He could not wait for nightfall. He ordered a coordinated assault that relied on brute force and sheer tenacity. He directed Lieutenant Thompson and the skirmishers of Company A to begin a direct frontal ascent of the bluff's lower slopes to draw the enemy's fire. At the same time, he ordered Captain Gunther's Company H to execute a wide flanking maneuver, climbing a steep, narrow ravine a half-mile to the north, intending to come out on the rim behind the warriors. The frontal assault was a gruesome exercise in courage. The soldiers rose from their cover and began to climb. The slope was a 45-degree angle of loose scree and boulders the size of wagons. The moment they exposed themselves, the red bluff erupted in smoke. Bullets struck the rocks around them, kicking up blinding clouds of red dust. The men slipped and slid, their boots scrambling for purchase. They fired their carbines upward, the recoil bruising their shoulders, the hot brass ejecting into their faces. It was suppression by volume. They could not aim effectively, so they fired to keep the enemy's heads down. Private William McCabe, a veteran of the Civil War, found himself pinned behind a slab of sandstone halfway up the slope. His canteen was empty, his mouth tasting of copper and grit. Above him he saw the flash of a rifle from a crevice. He waited for the rhythm of the shooter, shot, lever, aim, and then popped up, firing a snapshot. He saw a warrior jerk back, his rifle clattering down the cliff face. It was a small victory in a chaotic struggle, but it gave the men around him the courage to advance another 10 yards. They moved like insects, crawling over the heated stone, fueled only by the fear of staying where they were. On the northern flank, Captain Gunther's men faced a different challenge. The ravine they were climbing was choked with cedar and brush. It was steep and narrow, a natural funnel. The heat in the confined space was intense. There was no breeze. The air was stagnant and smelled of resin and sweat. They climbed in silence, hoping to achieve surprise. They pulled themselves up by tree roots and rock ledges. If the Comanches discovered them in this chute, they could be wiped out with a few well-placed rocks. Back on the canyon floor, the support companies kept up a steady drumbeat of fire against the rim. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out orders. The Springfield carbines began to fail in the heat. The copper cartridges, expanded by the rapid firing and the ambient temperature, stuck fast in the breeches. Soldiers cursed as they used their knives to pry the casings out, burning their fingers on the hot metal. Some men, in their frustration, banged the butts of their rifles against the rocks to jar the actions open, risking damage to the weapons. The rate of fire slowed, threatening to allow the warriors on the bluff to regain fire superiority. The stalemate broke not with a single dramatic moment, but with the accumulation of pressure. As Thompson's men pushed higher, the warriors on the forward edge of the bluff had to expose themselves more to fire down at them. This made them vulnerable to the long-range fire from the floor. At the same time, Gunther's flankers crested the rim to the north. They were exhausted, their uniforms torn, their hands bleeding, but they were level with the enemy. Gunther formed his men into a skirmish line and swept south along the rim. The warriors on the red bluff suddenly found themselves threatened from the rear. The tactical advantage of the high ground evaporated. They were now caught between the hammer of the climbing troops and the anvil of the flanking company. The taunts stopped. The fire from the bluff became sporadic and disorganized as the warriors turned to face the new threat. The fight on the rim was savage and personal. It was fought at ranges of less than 50 yards. The terrain was a maze of hoodoos and erosion channels. Men hunted each other through the rocks. A sergeant from Company H rounded a corner and came face to face with a Comanche warrior reloading his Winchester. The sergeant fired from the hip, the heavy .45 caliber slug knocking the warrior backward over the edge. The fight dissolved into a series of running skirmishes as the soldiers pushed the defenders back from the lip of the canyon. With the pressure on the bluff relieved, the soldiers on the lower Slopes surged forward. They crested the red bluff, cheering hoarsely through parched throats. They found the positions the Comanches had held, piles of spent brass, bloodstains on the rocks, and a few bodies left behind in the haste of the retreat. The view from the top was staggering. The entire battlefield was laid out below them, a smoking ruin of burning lodges, dead horses, and the tiny ant-like figures of their comrades moving through the wreckage. But the capture of the Red Bluff did not end the fighting. It merely shifted the location. The warriors retreated to the next ridge, and the next. They fought for every yard of ground to allow their families to escape across the high plains. The relentless advance ordered by Mackenzie became a grueling pursuit across the broken tableland. The soldiers had to clear the side canyons one by one. They had to flush snipers out of caves and crevices. It was slow, dangerous work. The silence that followed the taking of the primary fighting position on the Red Bluff was deceptive. It was not a peace, but a pause, a collective intake of breath before the next exertion. The soldiers who had gained the heights found that their victory was incomplete. The Red Bluff was not a singular peak, but part of a complex, serrated ridge system that extended for miles along the canyon rim. As the smoke from the initial assault cleared, it revealed that while the immediate precipice was in Army hands, the warriors had simply fallen back to a secondary line of defense. A series of limestone hoodoos and eroded gullies 300 yards further back on the tableland. From this new line, they opened a renewed, harassing fire that prevented the troopers from standing upright on the ground they had just captured. The heat on the exposed rim was even more ferocious than on the canyon floor. There was no shade here, no cottonwoods or canyon walls to block the sun. The wind, which had been absent below, blasted across the flatlands with the force of a furnace blower, drying the sweat on the men's skin instantly and leaving a crust of salt that stung their eyes. The wounded suffered terribly. Men shot during the ascent lay wedged behind rocks, baking in the sun, their cries for water lost in the wind. The stretcher-bearers, bandsmen who had put down their instruments to carry the injured, struggled up the steep slopes, slipping on the blood-slicked rocks, risking their own lives to drag their comrades to the relative safety of a shallow depression near the rim edge. Mackenzie, observing the renewed stalemate from a forward position, realized that the Comanches were trying to keep the escape routes open for the stragglers. The women and children who had fled earlier were still moving across the open plains, visible as distant specks. The warriors were fighting a rearguard action to buy them every possible second. This realization added a grim urgency to the operation. The cavalry could not allow the enemy to reorganize. He ordered Captain Boehm's Company E to move up and reinforce Gunther on the flank. The movement was slow. The horses were too exhausted to be of use in this broken terrain, so the troopers advanced on foot, their carbine boots flapping against their legs. They moved in a long, ragged skirmish line, utilizing the leapfrog tactic. One squad would lay down a base of fire, filling the air with lead to suppress the Comanche heads, while the other squad sprinted 20 yards forward to new cover. It was a slow, grinding advance, measured in feet rather than miles. The Comanches used the terrain with a mastery that earned the grudging respect of the professional soldiers. A single warrior hiding in a crevice with a buffalo rifle could hold up an entire platoon. They would fire, shift position, and fire again from a new angle, creating the illusion of multiple shooters. The heavy .50 caliber bullets from their Sharps rifles smashed into the limestone, sending rock shards exploding outward like shrapnel. A corporal in Company E lost an eye to a stone splinter, blinded instantly without ever being touched by lead. The sheer physical exertion of the battle began to take a toll on the weaponry as well as the men. The breech blocks of the carbines, fouled by the black powder residue of hundreds of shots, became difficult to close. Men had to spit on the mechanisms or pour precious drops of water from their canteens onto the actions to clear the fouling. The cleaning rods were in constant use, ramming lead slugs out of barrels that had become too hot to touch. The logistical strain was immense. Runners had to scramble up and down the cliff face, carrying heavy crates of ammunition to the firing line, their lungs burning, their legs cramping. As the afternoon stretched toward 4 o'clock, the light began to change, casting long, grotesque shadows across the hoodoos. This played into the hands of the defenders, who used the shadows to mask their movements. The cavalrymen squinted into the glare, trying to distinguish a warrior's head from a rock. The mental fatigue was crushing. Men began to make mistakes. A private stood up too soon to reload and took a bullet through the shoulder. Another dropped his rifle over the cliff edge, watching helplessly as it clattered down to the river far below. The breakthrough finally came when the scouts, led by the indomitable Lieutenant Bullies, located a dry wash that cut behind the Comanche position. Crawling on their bellies through the cactus and rattlesnake-infested brush, the scouts managed to get within point-blank range of the Quahati flank. They opened fire with their repeating Winchesters, unleashing a storm of lead that shattered the Comanche line. The warriors, realizing they were about to be encircled, finally broke contact. They mounted their ponies, which had been hidden in a dip in the land, and scattered in a dozen directions, dissolving into the vastness of the Llano Estacado. The retreat of the warriors from the secondary line signaled the true end of the battle for the Red Bluff. The silence that descended this time was heavy and final. The soldiers stood on the rim of the world, looking out over a landscape that was totally empty. The enemy had vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. There was no triumphant cheer, no waving of flags. The men simply sat down in the dirt, their heads hanging between their knees, gasping for air. From this high vantage point, the full scale of the operation below became visible. The canyon floor was a map of destruction. The fires from the burning villages had largely burned themselves out, leaving ugly black scars on the green valley floor. The river was a muddy ribbon, but the most striking feature was the herd. From the height of the bluff, the thousands of captured horses looked like a flowing liquid, a restless tide of brown, white, and paint that swirled in the box canyon where they had been corralled. Mackenzie stood on the edge of the precipice, the wind whipping his coat. He looked down at the herd, his mind already moving to the next problem. He had the ground. He had the horses. But he was hundreds of miles from his base, deep in hostile territory with tired men and no forage. He could not drive 10,000 wild horses back to Fort Concho. The Comanches would shadow him every step of the way, stealing them back night by night. He knew what he had to do. The taking of the Red Bluff had been the hard fight. The decision he was about to make would be the hard duty. He turned to his officers, his face a mask of resolve. "Get the men down," he said, his voice raspy. "Secure the perimeter on the floor, and bring the herd to Tula Canyon." The descent from the bluff was almost as difficult as the ascent. The men, their muscles cooling and stiffening, stumbled down the loose trails. They carried their wounded with infinite care, easing the stretchers over the drop-offs. They reached the canyon floor as the twilight began to purple the sky. The air down there was still hot, but the direct sun was gone. They walked toward the river, falling onto their bellies to drink the muddy water alongside their horses. The Battle of the Red Bluff was over. It had been a battle of inches, of rocks, of heat, and of will. It had proven that the United States cavalry could dislodge the finest light cavalry in the world from their own chosen fortress. But as the soldiers looked at the mass of horses milling in the twilight, they realized that the final act of the tragedy was yet to be played. The silence of the canyon was about to be broken by a different kind of sound, not of battle, but of execution. September 29th, 1874. The morning sun rose over the Palo Duro Canyon, revealing a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by the violence of the previous day. The smoke from the burning villages had settled into a low blue haze that clung to the river bottom, mixing with the morning mist. But the primary focus of the 4th Cavalry was no longer the charred remains of the lodges or the scattered warriors. It was the living spoil of the war. Corralled in the box canyon at the far end of the battlefield was a writhing, restless ocean of horseflesh. The captured herd numbered nearly 1,500 animals. It was a staggering sight, a physical representation of the wealth and power of the Comanche nation, now held within a cordon of exhausted blue-coated troopers. The first task of the day was the extraction. Moving a herd of semi-wild ponies up a narrow, precipitous trail was a logistical nightmare that rivaled the descent of the troops. The goat path that the soldiers had used to enter the canyon was too steep and narrow for a mass exodus of animals. The scouts located a wider, though still treacherous, trail leading up the southern rim. The process began at dawn. The soldiers, many of whom had not slept for 48 hours, were forced to become cowboys. They yelled, waved blankets, and fired pistols into the air to goad the reluctant lead mares onto the slope. The ascent was chaotic. The horses, smelling the open plains above but terrified by the confinement, crowded the trail. They bit and kicked at one another. Several animals lost their footing on the loose shale and tumbled backward, crashing into the animals below them in a tangle of broken limbs. The dust raised by 6,000 hooves was a choking red powder that coated the throats of the drovers. It took hours of sweating, cursing exertion to push the mass of animals up the 1,000-foot wall. When the last pony finally crested the rim and spilled out onto the flat tableland of the Llano Estacado, the soldiers collapsed in their saddles, their chests heaving. But the work was not finished. Colonel Mackenzie knew he could not stay on the rim of the Palo Duro. The water was down in the canyon, but the defensive position was poor. He needed to return to his supply wagons at Tool Canyon, 20 miles to the south. He gave the order to move out. The column formed up, a long, dusty snake moving across the high plains. The captured herd was placed in the center, flanked by companies of troopers with orders to shoot any animal that tried to break away. The Comanche warriors watching from distant ridges made a few half-hearted attempts to cut out small groups of horses, but the screen of rifle fire kept them at bay. The march to Tool Canyon was a grueling test of endurance. The adrenaline of the battle had faded, leaving behind a crushing fatigue. Men fell asleep in their saddles, only to be jerked awake as their mounts stumbled. They reached the Tule Canyon campsite in the before dawn. The sight of the white canvas tops of the supply wagons was a welcome relief to the soldiers. The infantry guard, who had spent 2 anxious days waiting for news, cheered as the cavalry rode in. But the cheer died in their throats when they saw the size of the herd. The valley floor at Tool was soon completely filled with the milling animals. The noise was deafening, a constant chorus of whinnying, squealing, and the thudding of hooves. Mackenzie called a council of his officers. The situation was clear. He held over 1,400 horses. He was deep in hostile territory, hundreds of miles from his base at Fort Concho. To drive such a massive herd back across the staked plains would require a significant number of his men to act as herders, weakening his fighting force. The slow pace of the drive would allow the Comanches to shadow them, picking off stragglers and potentially launching a stampede at night to reclaim their property. If the Comanches got the horses back, the entire campaign would have been for nothing. The mobility of the tribes was their greatest asset. Without horses, they were grounded. The colonel made the only decision military logic allowed, though it was a decision that sickened every cavalryman present. He ordered the herd to be culled. He allowed the scouts and the officers to select the best animals for their own use, perhaps 350 to 400 horses in total. The rest, over 1,000 animals, were to be destroyed. The order rippled through the ranks. These men were horse soldiers. Their lives depended on their mounts. They admired fine horseflesh. To kill a horse was a sin in the unwritten Bible of the cavalry. But they were also soldiers, and they obeyed. The execution was scheduled for that morning. September 29th dawned clear and hot. The selected horses were cut out of the herd and picketed separately. The condemned animals, 1,048 of them by the official count, were driven into a narrow cul-de-sac in the Tool Canyon breaks. It was a natural slaughter pen surrounded by steep walls that prevented escape. Company K and Company E were detailed for the firing squads. The men formed a line across the open end of the cul-de-sac. They were armed with their Springfield carbines. The order was given to commence firing. The noise that followed was unlike the roar of battle. It was a flat, rhythmic, industrial pounding. The soldiers fired into the mass of animals. At close range, it was impossible to miss. Horses screamed and collapsed. The herd panicked, surging back against the rock walls, climbing over the bodies of the fallen in a desperate attempt to escape the lead. The dust rose instantly, mixing with the gun smoke to create a blinding gray fog. The mechanics of the slaughter were gruesome. The single-shot Springfields had to be reloaded after every pull of the trigger. The troopers worked the levers mechanically. Fire, eject, load, fire. Their shoulders bruised under the repeated recoil. The barrels grew hot, burning their hands. The air filled with the coppery scent of fresh blood and the stench of perforated bowels. It was not a quick process. Killing over 1,000 large animals took time. The firing went on for hours. The soldiers had to rotate out, their ammunition pouches empty, their faces pale and set in grim lines. Fresh troopers took their places. It ceased to be shooting. It became labor. It was the hard, dirty work of war, stripped of any glory or romance. The horses that were not killed instantly thrashed on the ground, adding their cries to the cacophony. Officers moved through the carnage with revolvers, delivering coups de grace to the wounded animals. The ground turned into a quagmire of red mud. The boots of the soldiers were soaked in blood. The psychological toll was visible in the eyes of the men. Some wept openly as they fired. Others cursed the Comanches, cursed the colonel, cursed the army that forced them to do this. One young private, a farm boy from Ohio who had joined the cavalry to ride, found himself staring down the barrel of his carbine at a spotted mare that stood trembling amidst the piles of carcasses. She looked at him with wide, dark eyes. He hesitated, his finger freezing on the trigger. His sergeant barked at him to fire. The private closed his eyes, turned his head away, and pulled the trigger. The mare dropped. The private vomited into the dust. The sheer scale of the pile was hard to comprehend. As the bodies accumulated, they formed a mound that blocked the view of the canyon wall. The surviving horses, driven mad by the smell of death, tried to climb the ramp of carcasses to get away. They were shot down on top of their kin. It was a scene from the inferno, a mass of tangled limbs, glossy coats, and staring eyes. By mid-afternoon, the guns finally fell silent. The last of the herd lay still. A heavy, absolute silence descended on Tool Canyon, broken only by the buzzing of the millions of flies that had already begun to gather. The soldiers walked away from the slaughter pen, their heads low, dragging their rifles in the dirt. They did not speak to one another. They went to the creek to wash the blood from their hands and boots, scrubbing the leather until it was raw. The silence that followed the final volley was not truly silent. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that pressed against the eardrums, accentuated by the ringing tinnitus that plagued every man on the firing line. The cessation of the gunfire revealed the other sounds that had been masked by the explosions. The wet, settling noises of the carcass pile, the drone of the blowflies that arrived in black clouds, and the low, murmuring conversations of the officers conferring near the wagons. The reality of the act began to settle into the consciousness of the regiment. It was a stain that would not wash off with creek water. The logistics of the post-execution phase were as grim as the shooting itself. Mackenzie ordered that the equipment of the dead horses be salvaged before the column moved on. Soldiers had to climb onto the mound of bodies, their boots slipping on the slick hides, to cut away cinches and bridles. It was gruesome work. The carcasses were already beginning to bloat in the heat. The men worked with handkerchiefs tied over their noses and mouths, but the smell was inescapable. It was the smell of a butcher shop magnified 1,000 times. They tossed saddles and blankets down to the ground crews, who piled them into wagons or set them aside for burning. The army could not use the Comanche tack, and they would not leave it for the Indians to recover. Bonfires were lit to destroy the captured equipment. The smell of burning leather and wool joined the stench of blood. The smoke rose in thick black columns, acting as a beacon to any Comanche watching from the rim. It was a final signal of dispossession. You have no horses, you have no saddles, you have no home. The 350 horses that had been spared were a source of contention and complex emotion. These animals, selected for their conformation and strength, were distributed among the scouts and officers. But they were wild. They had to be broken to the army bit and saddle. In the midst of the carnage, a surreal rodeo broke out as the Tonkawa scouts and troopers tried to ride their new prizes. Horses bucked and sunfished, throwing riders into the dust. It was a bizarre counterpoint to the tragedy just yards away, a struggle for dominance between man and beast playing out in the shadow of the slaughter. Mackenzie walked the perimeter of the camp that evening. He observed his men closely. He looked for signs of mutiny or breakdown. He saw sullen faces, but he also saw resignation. They were professional soldiers. They had signed the paper. They took the coin. They did the work. But he noticed that the usual banter was missing. There were no songs around the campfires. The men cleaned their weapons with an obsessive focus, scrubbing the barrels until they shone, as if trying to clean the memory of the day from the steel itself. The medical officer, Dr. York, reported a spike in sickness. Men were complaining of nausea and headaches. It was a reaction to the smell and the stress. The doctor handed out quinine and whiskey, the universal cure-alls of the frontier army. But he knew there was no medicine for what ailed the 4th Cavalry that night. They were suffering from a moral injury, a bruise on the soul that came from destroying something beautiful for a strategic imperative. The impact of the day extended to the natural world around them. The scavengers of the high plains descended on Tule Canyon in numbers never before seen. Buzzards circled in a dark vortex that reached thousands of feet into the sky. Wolves and coyotes, usually shy of human encampments, prowled the edges of the firelight, their eyes reflecting yellow in the dark. They fought over the scraps, their snarling and yipping adding a feral edge to the night. The balance of the ecosystem had been disrupted by the influx of biomass. The infantrymen who had guarded the wagons while the cavalry fought looked at the horse troopers with a mixture of awe and horror. They had missed the battle in the canyon, and they had missed the execution. They saw only the aftermath. The bloody uniforms, the 1,000 dead horses, the haunted eyes. A divide opened between the two branches of the service. The cavalrymen carried the weight of the act. The infantrymen were merely witnesses. Mackenzie sat in his tent writing his report to General Augur. He kept the language clinical. He listed the number of lodges burned, the number of enemies engaged, and the number of horses captured and disposed of. He did not use emotional language. He did not describe the screaming of the mares. He wrote of military necessity and denying resources to the enemy. He knew that in Washington, far from the blood and the dust, the politicians would nod and approve. They would see only the statistics of victory. They would not smell the Tule Canyon. The next morning, September 30th, the column moved out. The departure was hasty, No one wanted to spend another hour near the bone pile. As the rear guard left the canyon, they looked back. The mound of carcasses was already changing. The bloating bodies had shifted. The scavengers had moved in. The Tool Canyon, once a quiet refuge with a sweet stream, had been turned into a graveyard. The legacy of the 1000 went beyond the immediate tactical victory. It changed the psychology of the Southern Plains tribes. In their culture, the horse was a sacred gift, a brother, a source of spiritual power. For the white men to kill them so casually, so industriously, proved that they were fighting an enemy who did not respect the laws of the world. It created a sense of hopelessness. How could you fight a people who would burn food and shoot horses? It was an enemy that waged war on life itself. As the 4th Cavalry marched south back toward their supply base to refit, they left a silence behind them that was profound. The thunder of the stampede was gone. The war cries were gone. The plains were empty. The wind blew over the grass, erasing the tracks of the column, but the bones in Tool Canyon would remain. They would bleach white in the sun, turning into a strange geological feature, a white reef in a sea of grass. They would mark the place where the West was, finally brutally won. The soldiers rode in silence, the rhythm of the march reasserting itself. Clop, 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 clop. The sound of their own horses' hooves was a comfort now, a reminder that they were still mounted, still mobile, still alive. But every man in the regiment looked at his mount with a new appreciation and a new fear. They patted the necks of their horses more often. They checked their hooves with more care. They knew now how fragile the bond was and how quickly the necessities of war could sever it. The 1000 had died, and in their dying they had taken the innocence of the 4th Cavalry with them. November 1874. The high tableland of the Llano Estacado, which in summer had been a furnace of shimmering heat and mirages, transformed with the turning of the season into an anvil of ice. The geography that had once provided a fortress for the Comanche and Kiowa people now became their prison. The wind, unobstructed by trees or mountain ranges for hundreds of miles, swept down from the Canadian Rockies with a velocity that could strip the heat from a human body in minutes. This was the season of the blue norther, the sudden, violent winter storms that turned the plains into a white hell, where visibility was reduced to the length of a man's arm, and the ambient temperature dropped 40 degrees in the span of an hour. For the families scattered across the waste, the weather was a more lethal enemy than the cavalry. They had escaped the trap of Palo Duro Canyon with their lives, but they had left their means of survival behind in the ashes of their lodges. The strategic brilliance and cruelty of Colonel Mackenzie's destruction of the winter stores became horrifyingly apparent as the first heavy snows began to fall. In a normal winter, a Comanche family would be sheltered inside a thick buffalo hide lodge, insulated against the wind by an inner liner and a fire burning in the center. They would sleep under piles of warm furs, eating from the supplies of dried meat, pemmican, and stored berries prepared during the autumn hunt. Now they had nothing. The lodges were ash, the robes were ash, the meat was ash. They faced the sub-zero temperatures wrapped only in the clothes they had been wearing when the soldiers attacked, light cotton shirts, trade blankets, and worn buckskins. The bands fragmented into small, desperate groups, moving constantly to avoid the army patrols that continued to scour the plains. General Sheridan's orders were total. Give them no rest. The soldiers, supplied by wagon trains and wearing heavy wool greatcoats and buffalo fur gauntlets, kept up the pressure. They found the trails of the refugees not by hoofprints, for there were few horses left after the slaughter at Tool Canyon, but by the debris of starvation. They found campsites where the snow was stained with blood from where the people had slaughtered their few remaining dogs for food. They found the bodies of the old and the very young, left behind when they could no longer walk, covered in a thin shroud of drift snow. For the Quahati Comanche, the people of the antelope, the degradation was absolute. They were the lords of the plains, a people who measured their worth in horses and freedom. Now they were reduced to pedestrians in a land that demanded mobility. Without horses, they could not hunt the few buffalo that remained scattered in the breaks. Without horses, they could not carry shelter. They walked with their heads down, leaning into the wind, their feet wrapped in rags and strips of green rawhide cut from dead pack mules. The green hide was a treacherous material. As it dried and froze, it shrank, becoming as hard as iron, chafing the skin until the feet were raw and bleeding or crushing the circulation entirely, leading to gangrene. Frostbite turned toes and fingers black, the dead flesh sloughing off in the thaw. Hunger became the singular driving focus of existence. The people ate anything that could be chewed and swallowed. They dug for roots in the frozen earth with knives and sharp sticks, breaking their fingernails on the permafrost. They caught field mice, lizards, and rattlesnakes that had gone into hibernation. When the dogs were gone, they looked at the few horses that had escaped the slaughter. To kill a horse was to destroy their only means of transport, but starvation dictated the choice. They ate the meat raw or barely seared over smoky fires made from sagebrush and buffalo chips, for there was no wood on the high plains. They cracked the bones and boiled them to extract the grease, drinking the broth to keep their internal fires burning. They chewed on their own moccasins and parfleche bags, trying to suck sustenance from the treated leather. Chief Iron Shirt led a small band of 20 people toward the breaks of the Canadian River, hoping to find shelter in the timber. His coat of old leather, once a symbol of his invincibility in battle, was now just a heavy weight of cold metal against his chest, conducting the freeze deep into his bones. He saw the ribs of his children protruding through their skin like the hoops of a starving barrel. He saw the hollow, dark-circled eyes of his wives. The discipline of the warrior society crumbled under the biological imperative of hunger. Men fought over the hind quarter of a coyote. Mothers chewed the tough meat first to soften it for infants who were too weak to suckle. The psychological toll of the flight was as damaging as the physical suffering. The tribes had always believed that the land would protect them. They believed that the Llano Estacado was their sanctuary, a place where the white man could not live. But the land had turned against them, and the white men had breached the sanctuary with wagons and corn. The confidence that had sustained them through centuries of warfare against the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the Texans evaporated. They were being hunted like animals, and like animals they were beginning to die in the open. As December approached, the weather worsened. A sleet storm coated the plains in a sheet of clear ice. The grass was locked away under the glaze, starving the few ponies that remained. The wind chill dropped to 20 degrees below zero. In the open, without fire, sleep was a death sentence. The people huddled together in depressions in the ground, piling their bodies into a heap to share warmth. Those on the outside of the pile often did not wake up in the morning. The survivors did not have the strength to dig graves in the frozen earth. They left the dead where they lay, frozen, statues on the white landscape, soon to be claimed by the wolves that shadowed the column. The army columns, commanded by officers like Major William Price and Lieutenant Colonel John Davidson, continued their sweeps. They engaged in few battles during these months because there was no one left to fight. The campaign became a roundup. Soldiers would crest a ridge and find a huddled group of 20 or 30 Indians. There would be no resistance. The warriors would simply stare at the soldiers, their weapons lying on the ground too weak to lift them. The soldiers, often shocked by the condition of their enemies, would distribute hardtack and blankets before marching them back to the forts. The capture was not a triumph of arms. It was a humanitarian intervention in a disaster of their own making. But many bands refused to be taken in the field. They made the decision to walk to the reservation on their own terms. It was a choice born of pride and desperation. They would not be captured, they would surrender. The destination was Fort Sill in the Indian Territory, the headquarters of the reservation agency. It was hundreds of miles away for some of the bands. The journey to Fort Sill became a funeral procession for the Comanche and Kiowa nations. The route was marked by suffering. A band of Kiowas led by Mamanti trudged east through the freezing rain. They were ghosts of the people who had danced the sun dance the previous summer. Their skin hung loose on their frames. Their hair was matted and filled with lice. They walked in silence. There was no energy for speech. The only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the wet, racking coughing of the sick. Pneumonia was rampant. It filled the lungs with fluid, drowning the victims on dry land. Children died in their mothers' arms, and the mothers carried the bodies for days, refusing to let them go until they fell from exhaustion. When they reached the vicinity of Fort Sill, the contrast between their condition and the world of the white man was stark. The fort was a place of ordered stone buildings, glass windows, and smoking chimneys. The soldiers wore thick blue coats and rode fat, grain-fed horses. The agency storehouses were filled with barrels of flour, sacks of coffee, and crates of sugar. The refugees looked at this abundance with eyes that had seen their children die for lack of a scrap of meat. They stood at the gates, a ragged, shivering mass, waiting for permission to enter the cage. The surrender process was formalized and humiliating. The warriors were ordered to stack their weapons. They laid down their Sharps rifles, their Winchesters, their bows and lances. These were the tools of their trade, the symbols of their manhood and their ability to provide. Giving them up was an act of spiritual castration. They were then ordered to turn over their remaining horses. This was the final blow. A Comanche man without a horse was not a man. He was nothing. They watched as the soldiers led the animals away to be sold at auction or shot to prevent them from being stolen back. The army was not content with mere surrender. The War Department had decided that the leadership of the hostile bands must be removed to prevent future uprisings. They compiled a list of chiefs and warriors considered to be the ringleaders of the war. Men like Lone Wolf, Mamanti, and others were singled out. They were not to be allowed to live on the reservation with their families. They were to be shackled and sent to a military prison at Fort Marion in Florida, thousands of miles away. The selection of the prisoners was a scene of intense anguish. The men were separated from their weeping wives and children. Blacksmiths riveted iron shackles onto their ankles. The clinking of the chains replaced the jingle of spurs. These men, who had roamed a territory larger than many European nations, were now confined to the space of a wagon bed. They were loaded onto transports for the long journey east, leaving behind a people who were leaderless and broken. Mamanti, the great owl prophet who had predicted the fall of the whites, sat in his chains, staring at the ground. His prophecy turned to ash. By February of 1875, the majority of the bands had come in. The agency rolls at Fort Sill swelled with the names of the destitute. The government rations promised in treaties were often meager and of poor quality. The beef was tough and stringy, often from diseased cattle. The flour was often weevil-ridden. But it was food, and the people ate it because the alternative was the white silence of the plains. They set up their camps in the shadow of the fort, living in canvas tents provided by the army, a poor substitute for the buffalo lodges of the past. There remained one significant holdout. Quanah Parker and the Quahati band had not yet surrendered. They remained out on the staked plains, surviving through sheer grit and an intimate knowledge of the land. They hunted the few straggling buffalo herds that had escaped the slaughter. They lived like wolves, moving constantly, hiding in the deepest canyons where the water still ran. But even Quanah, with his iron will, could not fight the reality of the changing world. The buffalo hide hunters were now swarming the plains in the absence of the warriors, killing the last of the food source. Colonel Mackenzie sent a messenger to Quanah in the spring. The messenger was a Comanche doctor and trader named Dr. Jacob Sturm, a man Quanah knew and trusted. Sturm found the Quahati camp near the headwaters of the Red River. He sat with Quanah and told him the truth. He told him that the other chiefs had surrendered. He told him that the buffalo were gone, wiped out by the sharpshooters. He told him that if he did not come in, the soldiers would come back in the spring, and they would not stop until every Quahati was dead. Quanah listened. He looked at his people. He saw that they were rags and bone. He saw the horse herd which he had tried so hard to rebuild was small and weak. He realized that the war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the stomach. To continue the fight was not bravery. It was suicide. He told Sturm that he would come in. The final march of the Quahati to Fort Sill in June of 1875 marked the absolute end of the Red River War and the era of the Free Plains tribes. When Quanah rode into the fort, he did not ride as a conquered subject, but he rode to a reality that he could not change. He was the last major chief to surrender. The column of his people that followed him was a testament to the brutality of the winter. They were the survivors of the walking dead, their faces etched with the map of their suffering. The transition to reservation life was a shock from which the people would struggle to recover for generations. The hunters were told to become farmers. Men who had known the thrill of the buffalo chase were given plows and told to break the hard earth of Oklahoma. The women, who had been the masters of the camp and the processing of the hunt, found their roles diminished in a system of government handouts. The culture, which was entirely dependent on the buffalo and the horse, had its foundation kicked out from under it. The physical health of the tribes plummeted in captivity. Diseases like measles, whooping cough, and influenza swept through the crowded stationary camps. The people, weakened by the winter starvation, had no resistance. The death rate at the Fort Sill Agency in the years immediately following the war was catastrophic. The silence of the plains was replaced by the sound of keening women mourning their dead. The walking dead continued to die even after they stopped walking. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was the crucible. It was the period when the physical destruction of the battlefields transformed into the permanent destruction of a way of life. The fire of the Comanche Empire, which had burned for 2 centuries and dictated the politics of the Southwest, had been extinguished not by water, but by hunger. The warriors who had once raided as far south as Mexico City were now standing in line for a ticket to collect a sack of flour. The soldiers of the 4th Cavalry, back at their posts, cleaned their gear and wrote letters home. They spoke of the campaign with a mixture of professional pride and personal relief. They had done what no other army had been able to do. They had pacified the southern plains. They did not dwell on the image of the frozen bodies on the Llano Estacado. They looked forward to the spring, to the promotions, to the next assignment. They were the agents of history, and history rarely looks back at the debris it leaves in its wake. In the end, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon was the decisive stroke, but the winter trek was the executioner. The canyon fight broke their material power. The winter march broke their hearts. The people who walked into Fort Sill were not the same people who had ridden out to attack the buffalo hunters at adobe walls. They had been transmuted by suffering. They had looked into the abyss of extinction and stepped back, but the price of that step was their freedom. The vast open ocean of grass which they had ruled as monarchs was now fenced and empty. The buffalo were gone. The horses were gone. And the walking dead sat in the agency offices, waiting for their names to be called, waiting for the beef ration, waiting for a future that had no place for them.